Good morning, guys, and welcome out to Revolution. And so in this video, we are going to examine some of the claims that the Textus Receptus has all these Latin readings in it. So this video is called, Did the Evil Latin Make Its Way into the Greek Textus Receptus and English King James Version? Now, I know a lot of people follow Scrivener. Now, unfortunately, what's happened is Scrivener, on the directions of Ellicott and Westcott and Hort, he produced the Textus Receptus. He produced an edition of the TR so that they could show where the Westcott and Hort text departed from the Textus Receptus. Okay. So unfortunately, what this has done, a lot of people believe that Scrivener was a TR guy. And this type of concept it's probably about 90% of people who I meet think this. They think, well, Scrivener's on our side, sort of thing. TR people, King James people, they usually say, well, Scrivener's part of our crew. Where really Scrivener, basically, he knew quite a lot about the King James. He had studied it, he had critiqued it, and he wrote quite a lot about the authorized version. But at the end of the day, he wanted to delete, I think I counted up to about 43 verses in his plain introduction editions. The number of places that he wanted, number of verses, the number of things that he wanted to delete from the authorized version just kept growing. And so to me, he's not even a majority text guy. I mean, this guy is a critical text guy. He worked with Westcott and Hort. So pretty much it's sort of like having someone who, say, if James White ran a book publishing company, or say like Logos, we know Logos, obviously they're compromised with their Faith Life group. Having Verbum, the Catholic branch of Logos, and they promote the Pope, and they tell you how to, you got books on how to pray the rosary and all this sort of stuff, and all sorts of strange Catholic beliefs. And so you got people who think Logos is fine. It's just sort of, trying to promote Christianity. Then you've got people who understand the corruption behind it. And I think it's not until you get to a certain level where you're examining Scrivener's material, you're looking at what Beezer and the King James guys did, and these guys are not the same type of bird. they're completely different. And in fact, Scrivener is more like the Westcott and Hort type of people than anything. So unfortunately, what happens is then critical text people use this type of argumentation. And they say, because, someone will say, well, Scrivener's a good guy. And all they have to do is point out things that Scrivener said, which are basically like Westcott and Hort. But every now and then he'll go with, the last 12 verses of Mark, I'm not sure about. And, the woman caught in adultery, so he might make a stance for something. So people go, wow, he's amazing. But really, he's just a critical text guy. I mean, I've heard people who are critical text guys like Matt Everhard. He did a video on why I'm a critical text guy, and I evaluated it and went, you're actually a majority text guy. He didn't even know like really anything about the critical text. He kept making majority text arguments. I said, you're actually a majority text guy. And it wasn't long after that he made a video, I'm a majority text guy. And so, but Scrivener's not even majority text. Scrivener is his own sort of weird thing. But even if Westcott and Hort never existed, if George Van Smith, a Unitarian who worked with them, who's like a Jehovah's Witness, if he'd never worked with them, Scrivener by himself would be a snake. You know what I mean? Now, just because he's produced a Textus Receptus, that doesn't make him exempt. Just because Billy Graham, preached and converted, people, or helped to to spread the gospel, it doesn't mean he's exempt from judgment. It doesn't mean he's exempt from the things that he said, that hell has no flames. And, I agree with the Pope on heaps of things. And Scrivener has said some really strange and bizarre and weird things over the years that King James people, Textus Receptus people should not agree with, and we should not promote. Now, it's a bit like I was saying with Logos. Imagine if Logos published the King James and did a very good edition. Well, we just have to agree with that. And if we're out street preaching and we run into someone, they're like, hey, I've got the Logos edition of the King James. It's like, well, that's good, And that's like with Scrivener. We just go, well, yeah, he's basically reproduced Beza's text with a smattering of changes. Now, he said there's 190 changes. I've examined a lot of those. I would suggest that there's probably 10% that are translatable. The rest of them are not translatable. So this basically means that the text, I was just checking the comments because sometimes I'm muted and I'm waffling on. The text is basically Beza's text. So if you're looking at 10% of those being translatable out of 190, you're looking at roughly about 20 places where there's a deviation from Scrivener and Beza. I mean, hardly anything. There's 260 chapters in the New Testament. If you have 20 places, I mean, it's hardly anything really. It's like one change in every 11 chapters, and these are really minor too. There's a couple that might be like 2 words, but usually these are mentioned in Beza's annotations anyway. So in the text that he made, the Greek text with his Latin translation, underneath he has annotations that speak about these issues as well. So he was weighing up these issues. The learned and thoroughly adequate King James translators looked at everything and just they went through Beza's and said Beza's is the closest, and there was 20 places. I mean, it's like, you imagine if I went through a document of 400 pages and I amended 20 places. It's hardly anything. And so this is what the King James translators did. They had the ability to do that. And so most people didn't go, well, it's a completely different Greek text. It's so close to Beza. So what happened with Scrivener, he's done a Greek text which shows every little detail. But because, number one, he's a critical text guy, sometimes there's bias in the way that he's showing things. Also because he actually isn't that great a scholar. Now, he is a scholar. I'm not saying that he's not, but he's not that great of a scholar. When you read through his works, when you examine what he's done, when you look at some of the conclusions that he comes to, it's like, oh, that's a weird thing to say. Why would he come to that conclusion? And sometimes he has a certain bias. So to me, this is like someone who is obsessed with the King James. So he looks like a King James sort of guy. He's, how the critical text guys are always like, I love the King James. It's amazing. I love it. This is fantastic. But then they just critique it and throw it under the bus. Scrivener sort of did that in an academic way. And I guess up until Westcott and Hort, there wasn't really any main contender. And I think Scrivener was a bit schizophrenic with his concepts too, where he worked on this text, but then he turned around and said, well, I think it's a great sin what Westcott and Hort have done. And it's like, well, haven't you been a part of this? Don't you know basic Bible doctrine that you don't hang around heretics? You don't hang around Unitarians, for crying out loud. So Scrivener, Westcott and Hort, these guys had a friend, George Van Smith, who was on the committee, and they were with him every day. These guys were having communion together. And so it's just ridiculous. And so But anyway, so what's happened is Scrivener has also made lots of lists of, this is where my TR departs from Beza's Textus Receptus, and this is where, Scrivener was used. This is where Stephanus was used instead of Beza, and here's a bunch of things. Here's where a whole bunch of Latin readings come into it. And these type of things were quite popular leading up to the Westcott and Hort edition, because there was sort of like a 50-year period where people were attacking the Textus Receptus, they were attacking the King James, and so a lot of people were believing stuff that now we look back at and go, that's strange, that's weird, why would they think that? And Unitarians had a lot to do with this as well, but there were people in academia like Scrivener who were basically saying quite illiterate things, but because they're cloaked in an air of academia, or they're cloaked in that robe of I'm an academic, people, even today, people see Scrivener as an authority. And this is one of the things when I used to listen to a lot of D.A. Waite's material, he would go back to Dean Burgon, and I've done videos on him. I would suggest if you if you think that Dean Burgon was a friend of the Textus Receptus, I would challenge you to watch the video that I've done, I think about a month ago on that, and critique it. And if I'm wrong, show me. But clearly he was not a Textus Receptus guy, and neither is Scrivener. And this is one of the problems, is people are not going back to the Reformation. They're going sort of halfway back to people who are, sometimes they can say the right thing and we can agree with them, but these are more like a James Snap type of person or a Maurice Robinson type of person. They're not TR people. And so imagine if in 100 years people were looking back to our time and they weren't quoting me, or they weren't quoting Christopher Yetzer or Bryan Ross or, other King James or TR people or the King James Bible Research Council. They're not quoting them. They're quoting James Snap Jr. or they're quoting Tim Berg, or and it's like you're going to get a level of inaccuracy. And so unfortunately, that's what we see happening. Now, from the get-go, I'm just going to let you know I have not read anything in this article. Now, I have read Christopher Yetz's article. Now, he did a 34-page article on the Latin, and he looks at Scrivener's 60. So that's mentioned in this article, because I just quickly went through and I was looking for the name Yetzer and I found it here. And so he does mention this article, which I'm glad, because I did want to segue from reading this article onto Christopher Yetz's material. And so what should I say first off? Just one thought I had through the week. I was talking to ChatGPT. Now, I would recommend anyone who wants to do scholarship into the Textus Receptus issue. ChatGPT is wrong on a lot of things. Okay, so you're going to be arguing with it, but every now and then it'll just throw a little gem out. And sometimes too, if you've got parallel concepts, it will help you to work those things out and to get real life examples. So I was thinking about the whole concept of how basically the critical text, the NA28, from the time of Westcott and Hort to today, they had the Westcott and Hort text, then they mixed it with the Weiss and the Weymouth and the Tischendorf. And so this was mixed to create the Nestle text. Then the Nestle text became the Nestle Alarm text. And how they produced that was they actually went back to the Westcott and Hort, put it as their primary text, and then they amended that text accordingly. And so that's what Metzger said. So they've had the Westcott and Hort, they've mixed it with a few others, then they've gone back to the Westcott and Hort. But what they've done is they've put this apparatus in. So the NA28 isn't just their text, it's the apparatus. So what they do is a bait and switch, where when James White's talking about the NA28, he will say, well, we've looked at everything, but they actually haven't. And I was asking ChatGPT for some real life examples of where people will sell a product like a shampoo or something. And really it's like 2 or 3 basic ingredients, but they're like, we have conducted scientific experiments into the magical teardrop of a Tibetan yak, and we've looked at the extract of almond seeds and all this stuff, but really it's just they've gotten a few things and throw it into the mix, and it's just like water, soap, and just some basic products. And so there are groups out there for sales. What they do is they give this air that they've looked at everything. And this is what James White says. We have 5,800 manuscripts, and we've examined all of them. The King James translators didn't have all this. We've looked at everything, but they actually haven't. The majority text hasn't even looked at everything. The majority text is based upon 300 or 400 manuscripts. Now, there might be a bit more today that people have looked at, but the majority text of Hodges and Fast in the 1980s was based on about 300 to 400 manuscripts. That's not the majority. So it's a microcosm of a majority, okay? And so it's not like they've looked at everything. And what they're making out is that they're examining everything. They're not changing the text according to the vast majority. And so it's a bit like me holding up the same shampoo bottle that they've sold since 1900 or something. And I'm like, well, we've conducted scientific experiments, and we've looked at this and looked at that, but the product's exactly the same pretty much. It's like, oh, we put a tiny sprinkle of cinnamon on it. They're not really interested in the apparatus. The apparatus is like, that's a sales pitch. The apparatus is there to make you think that they're looking at everything, but they're not. They're just going with the Westcott and Hort drizzle of, Unitarianism, basically Sinaiticus Vaticanus primacy, a little bit of, a few little readings from other places, but it's like, that's basically it. That's what they're going with. And they're still selling this product, and the sales team has gone, how can we actually suck people in to think that we're examining absolutely everything? It's like, well, let's actually examine things, but we won't change the text. We'll just have the same text, but we'll put them together. Then people will think, wow, these guys are scientists. And so, it's so strange that they do this. But I guess, we see food products do this. People will sell some sort of magical protein sort of thing, where really it's just the same product that they've had for years and years and years, and they're claiming new scientific updates and all this sort of stuff. And it's like, they're making out that this is a science. They're making out the coherence-based genealogical method. They're making out that this is some sort of super AI type of thing. I remember watching an interview with Bruce Metzger, and in the night, it was like 1978 or something, 1979. And he's like, we're using computers now with this. And it's like, yeah, anyone in any type of field is using computers, I mean, even flat earthers were using computers, It's like, it just gives this air of like, we're doing something really important, where we're using cutting edge technology, where at the end of the day, they're just selling you the same old slop that is from the bottom of the barrel, the Westcott and Hort Vaticanus Sinaiticus mush. And it's like, the same old rubbish from the local shop sort of thing. It's like, this broth. And it's like, yes, we went overseas and we looked at fine cuisine from Paris or whatever, and it's like, but they're not even using that. They're not utilizing this science. And every now and then they might drop a tiny little crumb, and change a reading here and there, and it's like, really, they just basically got a Westcott and Hort text. So so that's the first thing I thought I'd mention. I was going through ChatGPT and looking at that. Now, the second thing I want to mention is we have a discussion happening, okay? So this is in 7 days. This is the free will predestination discussion between Matt Singleton and Will Kinney. This is Saturday, the 23rd of August, 5 p.m. So this is New York City time. And this is going to be on this channel. So we invite you to come along. So it's not a debate, but it's a discussion. So it's a half debate, half chat sort of thing. So I guess it's up to these guys whether it gets heated or whether it's all peace, love, and mung beans and kumbaya. Maybe we'll all sing kumbaya at the end and hold hands. But I just thought I'd mention this, that this is happening next week. What else do I have to say? So yeah, I'm going through the Papyri 1 video, and I'm putting all that information into my website, or else it just gets lost in YouTube land. And then I look on my website 5 years later, and that information that I learned is just gone. So I won't do another Papyri video until I've extrapolated the material or the conclusions that we came to from that. Now I'll catch up with the chat, and then I'll start reading through this argument. So Helg is saying, what a title. And from the get-go, I just want to say what I've noticed, King James guys and critical text guys, most of these people think the Latin is satanic. They think that the Latin is evil. And I guess this comes from the fact that the Roman Catholic Church basically said, we're not going to go with the Greek, we're just going to stick with the Latin, okay? Now, had they not done that, the Latin would just be another language. I mean, we don't see Syriac as satanic or anything. We don't see the Ethiopic as being from the devil, but usually when it comes to the Latin, it's like, the Roman Catholics, they wanted the Latin. They didn't want to change the Latin. And oftentimes in the anti-King James rhetoric, people are like, well, the Latin was something they didn't want to change, and Erasmus had to fight against this sort of thing. So what usually happens is the chick tract style, the old, chick tracts where it's like, the Latin is sort of evil, but the Greek is good, and that led to the King James sort of thing. And the two streams concepts, which I think it's healthy for people to actually talk about these things. People seem to demonize the Latin, but I've usually for the last 10 years, I guess, I've said there are three in the closed class of witnesses. You got the Greek, you got the Latin, and you got the early church writers. Okay, so the Greek is primary. Erasmus did not put any reading into his text unless it was in the Greek. The one place where he said he amended the text according to the Latin was in Revelation chapter 22, verse 19. Specifically, he says that, not from verse 16 to verse 21. The whole concept of the last 6 verses missing is a myth, okay? Now, they found this manuscript like 300 years after Erasmus and said, this is the manuscript that he used, but it's very different. And how did he spot homo euteliaton at Revelation chapter 22, verse 19, if he didn't have verse 19 in his text? So that would make him a liar in his annotations. That would make him an idiot. And basically, Jan Kranz says that he had a Joe Biden moment. You know how we went through Revelation 16:5 and we're like, hey, Beza said he had an ancient manuscript. And Jan Kranz is like, yeah, well, these guys smoked a lot of crack back in those days. And, they were like Joe Biden wandering around with an ice cream dribbling around their arm, like, oh, I don't know what's going on. So critical text guys, they major in slander. And so if they're not going to slander you, they'll probably just do both. But they'll slander you. They'll slander the King James guys. They'll slander Erasmus. They'll slander Beza. And of course, they're brilliant guys. But they just, this one thing. Sorry, they were Joe Biden's. They were getting old. That was the whole thing with Beza. Oh, he was getting old, and he tricked himself. He thought he had a reading, but he didn't. This sort of thing. So the official with Jan Kranz is that Erasmus he tricked himself. And he made up things in Revelation chapter 22 to basically hide the fact that he only had one manuscript or something like that. It's like, no, he was very clear that he spotted homoiouteleuton there. And he said there was a few words that he amended, and he knew that the guys from Aldous Manutius print shop, he knew that they had manuscripts of Revelation because he lived with Aldous for 9 months. And so he said to them, because it's not like they could just send an email or whatever. This was his way of saying, hey, guys, this tiny little bit here, I need you guys to have that reading that you have and amend it. And that's exactly what they did. And so this becomes this fantastical story, and it becomes an anachronism because it's in his 1516 text 2 years before Aldous had printed his edition. And so he didn't have his edition then. And so what James White does, he plays this shell game where he tells one story and then he moves it over here and moves it over there, and he's like, ta-da, and in the end you end up thinking, oh, Erasmus is an idiot. But this comes from Jan Krans. Jan Krans is sort of like the academic behind a lot of these stories. So James White's the guy who popularizes this sort of rubbish, but Jan Krans is the guy who actually, puts pen to paper and writes out this sort of stuff like it's true. So he's the storyteller, and James White's just the guy who, they push in front of the stage, and he does the juggling, and he's the entertainment wing for the Bible industrial complex. And so with Helg saying, wow, what a title, the whole concept of evil Latin being evil somehow, Erasmus wouldn't even put 1 John 5:7 into the text, even though it's in 90% of the Latin. It's, if you were to get all the manuscripts together, okay, if you were to get the Greek and the Latin manuscripts, put them together, the Comma Johanneum is in the majority of those because it's in the Latin. And so Latin, there's way more Latin than we have Greek because Latin just became popular. Greek was popular and because of Alexander the Great, but eventually that sort of waned, and the Greek became the language of academics. Obviously that was part of the whole Koine Greek period where that was very commonly used in the world. But then eventually Latin won out, and everyone was speaking Latin, a bit like today with people speaking English. It's overtaken, and so you can't just dismiss Latin, especially when you know that Paul wrote letters to Rome, like Bible letters to Rome in Greek. So what would they have done in those days? They would have translated that straight into Latin. So the Latin was early. People would have read Latin and wanted it translated from Greek into Latin. A lot of people wouldn't have read Greek. A lot of them would. A lot of them wouldn't have. And so they wanted things translated. So Latin being early is very important. And a lot of the time where we see things in Greek that can be in some manuscripts that can be twisted or changed, oftentimes we look at the Latin and it just makes perfect sense. It's like, oh, okay, that's in the Latin. We look at the Greek and go, well, something's happened there. But the Textus Receptus is based on Greek readings. Erasmus, he went through his whole New Testament, and he clearly he didn't put 1 John 5:7 because he's like, well, where's this in the Greek manuscripts? Then it was like, Codex Britannicus has it, and then he's looking at grammatical issues. He's looking at what Jerome said, the unfaithful scribes were taking this out, but he knew it was in the Latin. He's not a dummy. He would have been transcribing these. He would have been copying these as an Augustinian monk. And so for him, it's there, but he wants to show these Greek readings. Okay. So obviously, if he's not even going to put the Comma Johanneum in because it's not in the Greek, what do you think he's just going to do that? turn around and put Latin readings in everywhere. No, what the critical text guys have done, Franz Delitzsch has found this manuscript that has Reuchlin's name on it, and it's a book of Revelation, and it's an Andreas commentary. Now, Reuchlin, he collected manuscripts. He could have had 50 copies of this. He could have had 2. But at the end of the day, that manuscript that he claims is Erasmus is most probably not Erasmus's manuscript, because the last 6 verses are missing. And Erasmus commented on the details of some of those verses. How could he have done that if that's the manuscript? You know what I mean? And so, and also the whole concept of him only using one manuscript, I would question that. And this is something that I'm doing at the moment. It's a bit of a side project that I'm doing. I'm questioning these claims of Erasmus having one manuscript for Revelation. I know at times he would say, in a conversation with Lee or other people, he would, Stunica, he would say, I have one manuscript for this particular reading, but that doesn't mean he had one manuscript for the whole entire book of Revelation. Sometimes, even in the book of Revelation, he says the Greek copies, plural, say this. And then he will talk about how he went to Lorenzo Valla's material, annotations. Lorenzo Valla, he had access to a whole bunch of things that Erasmus didn't have access to. And when Erasmus was in Venice, Bessarion, he was collecting manuscripts. You can go to the museum there today and look at all the manuscripts that Bessarion had. Now, I'm not exactly sure what he has there, but what I'm saying is Erasmus had access to a lot more than people give credit for. Someone like James White will turn around and say, well, the King James is based upon 6 manuscripts. Like the King James is based on 6 manuscripts, not just Erasmus's first edition, which I would say, no, that's ridiculous. I would say Erasmus had access to probably hundreds of manuscripts, but you can't just go to a library. You can't go to the Vatican Library and say, I want to keep these. They go, sorry, we don't really care how important you are. You can't just keep them. Maybe write down some notes, Erasmus, And so just because his pile of manuscripts that he had in front of him were, from the Basel Library, obviously, that's a place where he's at. They know him. He's got good rapport. He can be there with a lot of these manuscripts, but he was going through the libraries of Europe collecting readings. And so he would have lists of annotations. He spent a long time in England. He would have written lists of annotations and variants and things like that. And so it wasn't just like, I've gone to Basel, I have to forget everything that I've ever done before, and I've just got this paltry little, one Greek edition here, and oh no, what am I going to do? We just have to print that. That they make out that Erasmus is the biggest bozo on the planet. Erasmus is really well respected in academic circles when it comes to intellectuals, when it comes to people who are interested in linguistics, people who are interested in the Latin language, people who are interested in Greek language. The only place he seems to be completely demonized is by the critical text guys. And unfortunately, majority text people tend to just parrot that because they look it up and they go, oh, Metzger said he was an idiot and James White said he's an idiot. Maybe he is an idiot, and they just start parroting it. But Erasmus, he wrote 200 books. And we're talking about in an era when he was the prince. They called him the prince of the humanists. Humanist meaning he knew Greek, he knew Latin, he knew the early church writers. A lot of people learnt from Erasmus. He was the leading guy for pushing works of the early church writers, of Jerome, of Chrysostom. He was pushing that Cyprian. He knew their writings intimately. He was the prince of the humanists, but they just make out that he's an idiot. And so Erasmus always went back to Greek readings. Okay. Now, unfortunately, what's happened is Scrivener has made a list and said, well, these are Latin concepts. And a lot of the time, like as far as my research goes, we're going to read through this in a minute. He would say something like Beelzebub is that's a Latin reading, sort of thing. And it's like, look, English, like England had, the Romans were there for hundreds of years. But then the Germanic language, which Anglo-Saxons, there's a lot of roots in English into Germany and into France, and they're Latin-based languages. And so, of course, there's going to be Latinisms, but that doesn't mean they've just gone to the Latin Bible. Okay, so if it has Beelzebub, if everyone in England's using the word Beelzebub, that's what they use. It doesn't matter if it says it in the Vulgate. It doesn't matter where it says it. If they're using that name, that's the popular name that they have translated Beelzebul in the Greek to Beelzebub, and that's just the way it is. And so Scrivener will say, oh, that's from the Latin Vulgate. So that's one of them. But he only changes it in one place in his Greek, which is strange because it appears 5 places. But I'm pretty sure that Christopher Yetzer touches on this anyway. But in my research into Scrivener, a lot of these places where he's saying, the Latin enters the King James, it's so questionable because they were to go with the common names spoken in England at the time. So if we look at sometimes Judas, Jude, and Judah have the same Greek underlying word. And so, but they actually amended that because they understood that people were a bit like the book of Judas just before the book of Revelation. It's like the book of Judas. Is that Judas Iscariot? So having Jude there, we don't think about that. But just wording names in a certain way, that's how the English, the popular English way of saying things, they adopted those type of methods. So say if you look at the word Paul or the name Paul from Paulos, they basically just have it as Paul. They're not going to say Paulos or get too fancy or whatever. But when they have Timothy, they have Timothy and Timotheos. Now, Timothy and Timotheos were very famous names. Who was it? Shakespeare, he'd written a play and one of the main characters was Timotheos. And so it was quite a popular name in England. And so they used both Timothy and Timotheos for the same person, which is quite interesting. So, but the King James translators, they were skilled in languages. They understood the Greek, they understood the Latin, and they understood the ramifications of translating something into English and how that would affect the people of the day. And so they did everything with thoughtfulness, with skill. And just because it sounds a little bit Latin or has an etymological link to a Latin word, they didn't go, oh no, it's Latin, we can't use it. They used everything. If something had an etymological link to a French word, they weren't like, oh no, French are evil, apparently we can't use that, or whatever. That people saying there's Latin influence, to me, it's just over the top. But we're going to go through this article and we're going to go through Christopher Yetzer's. So Hilly Billy is living the dream. He's in the house. A few other people just saying g'day. Okay. Bryan Ross is in the house. Yeah, I mentioned the name. Oh, it's like in Latin, if you say it, if you mention something, it'll appear. So I mentioned Bryan Ross's name and he appeared with a Gail Rippling Get t-shirt on. just a bit of a joke there. Following Truth says James White uses about 50, but mainly just 2. Yeah. Hilly Billy says when he says we've examined them all, it's like me saying we went to the moon. Where do I get this magic protein, Nick? Well, just eat meat. You'll be fine. Matt Singleton says, Wimpy Westcott. Hefty received text. Helg says the TR proteins and natural ingredients, carnivore, keto. The critical text NA28, ultra processed food. Yeah. But they've looked into it. It's like having on the back like all these scientific things that they've done, and it's just basically 3 or 4 products or just a handful of sugar. I wonder if they come out with a Vulcan version of the TR. Salve Omnis, Hilly Billy, Shalom Ahena, or how about a TR version in dual languages, Vulcan and Klingon? Helg says TR Trump and CT Biden. Ooh. Assassination attempt against the TR. Ahena speaking in Latin, so he's just summoning demons. Hilly Billy says, Matthew, did you see the episodes of Fraser? So I won't get into all that. Okay, these guys are chatting about some episode. Okay, I think I got to the end. All right, let's go through this. Now, what I might do, I might make this full screen so you don't see me, but you'll see the writing and we can all read along. Maybe I can make it nice and big and navigate it so it's, yeah, that's good. That's perfect. So this article, so it's from the King James Bible Research Council. And so I know some people have been like, why have you been critical of the King James Bible Research Council? I haven't really. I went through one video when it first came out, and it wasn't when it first came out. I guess it was a newer sort of video, and it was claiming that P52 had TR readings, and I'm like, okay, cool. So I examined it, got halfway through the video, and went, that's not true. And it's actually got the Westcott Hort reading, but it was sort of downplayed, and so I sort of felt that was a bit disingenuous. I'm not on the side of anyone. I'm on the side of truth, okay? So if Mark Ward says something and it's like, okay, he's overstepped the mark there, he said something wrong, I'll point it out. If, like sometimes I do that, and I'd make a retraction video and go, well, yep, I thought it was this way, but it's actually that way. King James Bible Research Council, I'm like, well, let's look at the claims. And so I know some other people, Dwayne Green has done videos after the one that I did, and he's gone on to look at some of the other claims in that video. But I just sort of went, it's not really, like just that one thing made it a little bit like, I don't think it's going to get better. There's probably mistakes in the other claims as well. So I just sort of dropped it. But Dwayne Green's going through that, and it seems that people are going through the King James Bible Research Council with a fine-tooth comb, looking for things like, looking at the issues of 1 Corinthians 1:18 with being saved and all this sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, I've just pointed out like a few things. It doesn't mean I'm necessarily in agreement with what everyone else is saying, but it doesn't mean I'm in disagreement with them either. If they're saying truth, we just have to go, it doesn't matter who said it, whether James White said it, Mark Ward said it, Dan Wallace said it, Bart Ehrman said it, Peter Ruckman said it, Guy Ripplinger said it, King James Bible Research Council said it, I said it. We just got to go through and go, oh, this is correct, this isn't. And so that's why when I'm going through this, I might find some stuff that's not correct, and I'll just mention it. But I would expect that I'd find way more that I actually agree with than I disagree with. And I think that's the thing, is having a healthy critique is good, and it should be invited. I invite people to go through my videos and say, hey, Nick, you said this, but it's wrong. Or you're saying this and it should be better said this way. I want that. And so this is on the King James Bible Research Council.org website. And this says Calvin George falsely accuses the King James Version of departing from the Textus Receptus. Okay. Calvin, so this is by Emmanuel Rodriguez, and I'm pretty sure Emmanuel Rodriguez, he is the president of the Reina Gomez Society or Bible. I remember him mentioning something. I listened to something of his recently, and I think these guys do a fantastic job. To me, this is sort of where the Dean Burgon Society has gone to. I understand with the Dean Burgon Society with the Waits, obviously D.R. Waits passed away, but a lot of those guys have become very elderly, and there's not that much that they can do much anymore. So it's sort of become a little bit scattered, where these guys seem to have been very influenced by them, and they're like, let's create another society that's sort of continuing on in the similar sort of vein. And so, and every now and then I'll tune into what they're saying. I'm like, that's great. That's brilliant. Now, apparently Dan Hafley has left that group. Now, there were certain things I wasn't happy with what Dan Hafley has said, but then there's other things that I'm like, oh, that's actually really good. His recent stuff with Bryan Ross on the two stream stuff, I'm like, yeah, they made a really good point that the critical text just wasn't around. It just wasn't used. And pretty much what's amazing too, when you say to people, okay, so where was your Bible in the Reformation? They're like, and they always have to go back to Vaticanus. And then it's like, okay, so before Vaticanus was used or known about, Erasmus was basically the one who said, oh, we got this manuscript. He examined it. Before that, where was your Bible? And they're like, non-existent. They don't have anything. And so this is the amazing thing. They don't have a Bible in those days. The Bible was raptured, I guess. Anyway, I could talk about that for hours. So Emmanuel Rodriguez, and I really appreciate what these guys have done with the Spanish Bible. I think that is what we need, is more proactive Textus Receptus people. I actually didn't want to get into this situation where I'm constantly defending the Textus Receptus. I'd already settled it in my heart. It's like, okay, well, obviously it's the Textus Receptus. King James is the best translation that you can get from the TR. And it's like, okay, let's move on. There are millions of people out there. They need Bibles. Let's just go through and let's do Bible translation work. Let's encourage people who are doing this. Let's promote Bibles in other languages. And so that's been my heart for years and years and years. But then with the Revelation 16:5 thing, I sort of got sucked into that vortex of like defending. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. But I can see the hand of God on it. And so I take my hat off to these guys. What they've done in Spanish is brilliant. And a lot of people are saying it's a great translation. And I think the thing is, too, these guys are constantly looking at things, looking at arguments for and against. And as time goes on, this will probably be one of the most important things that has happened in the Spanish-speaking world in the last, 200 years. And I know that people will go, oh, it's just a Bible translation. No, this is so important. That's how important I think this issue is, that the true Bible gets out there. Having these Bibles with errors and with mistakes, this causes doubt, this causes confusion, and the well is so poisoned that usually when people go, okay, I'll study that, they end up, like Delilah in Samson's got his head in the lap of Delilah, and she's stroking his hair, sort of thing. That's where most people end up, in the lap of James White or Dan Wallace or some Metzger or some weirdo. And I was thinking the other day, and I just want to make this announcement that this is what I think and this is what I believe. I don't think James White's saved. Now, if people want to cut that out, make a little video on it and send it to him, I don't think he's a Christian. I listened to one of his presentations the other day, and I was like, no, that's a lie. No, that's a lie. No, that's a lie. That's a lie. That's a lie. That's a lie. And usually if someone's living like that and they're saying stuff that's just lie after lie after lie after lie, and they know better, They've been shown, but they just want to push whatever they've got. They're a con man. It just makes more sense to go, they're not saved. It just makes more sense rather than, maybe I could correct him and maybe the Holy Spirit will show him, I'll pray for him. I mean, people have done that for years and years and years, and he's lying more than ever. Like, there's stuff that he's been shown, and it's like, you shouldn't be repeating this rubbish, James. But he just does. And he seems to have no conscience. So I'm just going to say, I don't know where you stand with him. I would say James White is not a Christian, and I think he actually has a demon. And so if you don't like me anymore, so be it. But that's what I think. And I was thinking about a lot yesterday. I listened to maybe 3 or 4 hours of James White, and I just came out of that situation going, it makes so much more sense to go, he's not saved. And he has a demon. And so anyway, I know a lot of people won't like me anymore because I said that. But hey, I'm not here to win friends and influence people. I'm here to say truth as I see it. So one of Calvin George's biggest arguments to justify obvious critical text corruption in the 1960 Reina Valera is his claim that the King James Version also has the critical text in it. This is false, however. Okay, so let's read this. Calvin George is a defender of the critical text departures from the Textus Receptus in Spanish Bibles. He also claims to be pro-KJV in English. It is not difficult to see the inconsistency between his positions in English and in Spanish. One of Calvin George's, I have no idea who Calvin George is, by the way. One of Calvin George's biggest arguments to justify obvious critical text corruption in the 1960 Reina Valera is his claim that the KJV also has the critical text in it. This is false, however. There are no critical text corruptions in the King James Version. There are no departures from the Textus Receptus in the King James Version, as Calvin George claims. So it seems a strange position he's saying. It seems like he's saying two things. Now, I guess this will become clearer as we go along. There are no departures from the Textus Receptus in the King James Version, as Calvin George claims. He's twisting the facts and spreading misinformation for his personal agenda to defend the indefensible. He accuses us, so I guess that's the King James Bible Research Council, of having a double standard. His argument goes as follows. Why this is a double standard? The King James, so this is quoting Calvin George. Why this is a double standard? The King James Version has a few departures from the Textus Receptus. Yes, yet this should not invalidate the King James Version. And then the explanation of this is FHA Scrivener became intimately acquainted with the text of the King James Version during his work on the New Testament in the original Greek according to the text followed by the Authorized Version. He placed a list of around 60 places in which he believed the King James Version apparently followed the Latin Vulgate in the New Testament on page 262 of his book, The Authorized Edition of the English Bible. Jack Mormon, a pro-KJV author, wrote on page 27 of the second edition of his book, When the King James Version Departs from the Majority Text, that there is a sprinkling of Latin readings in the Authorized Version. The question should be whether a foreign translation is based on the Textus Receptus, not whether there are any departures whatsoever. No one is calling to revise the TR departures in the King James Version. Therefore, calling to revise TR departures in foreign Bibles that are already based on the TR is a double standard. So that's from his article, Double Standards in the Spanish Bible Issue. So it seems like a weird position that this guy has. So anyway, I guess that's why they're addressing it. So firstly, it says, Calvin George quotes Jack Mormon out of context. Dr. Mormon said there is a sprinkling of Latin readings in the Authorized Version. Pay careful attention to the way Calvin George quotes Jack Mormon here. George is being very deceptive because he uses the quote of Mormon as if the sprinkling of Latin readings in the King James Version is supposed to be considered a bad thing. In other words, George wants the reader to think that these Latin readings in the King James Version were corrupt critical text readings which depart from the TR. This is false. George is ripping a good man's quote out of context and twisting it to serve his agenda, to convince his audience that it's okay for a Bible to have some critical text sprinkled in it. If George would have given the entire statement, the reader would clearly see that Mormon was actually complimenting the King James Version for the sprinkling of Latin readings. Here is Jack Mormon's entire statement in context. Okay, so this is Jack Mormon. The Latin Christians who oppose Rome had a far more vital faith than that which is usually categorized by the Greek East. We look to them for our spiritual heritage, and they were an important channel through which God preserved his word. This helps explain why there is a sprinkling of Latin readings in the Authorized Version. Remember also that many of the great doctrinal words of our English Bible are based on Latin and not Greek derivative. So page 28 to 29, when the King James Version departs from the majority text by Jack Mormon, see pics in the addendum of the page of this quote in its entirety. So back to the article. Everything Jack Mormon says about this sprinkling of Latin readings in the Authorized Version is positive. Mormon goes on to explain that the Latin text complemented the Greek text and served as great evidence to confirm purity and faithfulness to the original. So this is Jack Mormon. Christ promised that the Holy Spirit would guide believers of each generation into all truth, John 16:13. With regard to the text of Scripture, all truth was found in one primary source with some complement from another. The primary source was the Greek-speaking East, with occasional refinement and verification from the Latin and Syriac areas, page 29. And so back to the article. Notice what Dr. Mormon says that the Latin does. It provided refinement and verification. These are good things. Jack Mormon is showing us that the Latin evidence helped to refine the King James Version text and verify its purity. It should be clear from Jack Mormon's statements here that he did not consider the sprinkling of Latin readings in the King James Version to be corrupt, but rather pure renderings that agreed in substance with the Textus Receptus. We will see soon that the Latin that Mormon said was sprinkled in the King James Version was good Latin readings from pure Latin texts. Jack Mormon in no way, shape, or form is implying what George claims. Basically, Calvin George is lying, plain and simple. He is twisting what Mormon said to rip someone's words out of context and to twist them in an effort to make it look like he agrees with your agenda is downright dishonesty. Calvin George gets away with this, however, because most people are not going to take the time that we do to check his statements. Just a little bit of homework would reveal that George is deliberately misleading his audience to fit his agenda to defend the critical text in the Reign of Valera 1960 edition. Okay, so it sounds like Calvin George has a bit of a barrow to push, and he will just sort of quote King James people and say, look, even this guy said there's Latin readings, blah, blah, blah. Now, he could probably find other people who do say there are Latin readings, because I hear this quite a lot. And in the Textus Receptus Academy, people who are TR people just say, yeah, there's Latin readings in there. And I've probably for like 15 years been like, no, that's not right. But sometimes when you're trying to explain that you have the Greek readings, so the three closed class of witnesses, you have the Greek, you have the Latin, and you have the early church writings. The Greek corrects the Latin polishes the Greek, and they're both guided by the writings of the early church, which wrote in Greek and in Latin. And so understanding that these three, that's basically the three pillars of the Textus Receptus. And so when you look at the work that Erasmus did, Stephanus, Beza, they were working on the text. They knew Latin, they knew Greek, they knew the early church writings. And then outside of that, you can go to the Syriac. That's outside of the closed class of witnesses. And so you can go to the Ethiopic, you can go to the Coptic, you can go to all these other things. But the main pillar for the Textus Receptus is the Greek. That's number one. That's primary. And as I said, Erasmus did not put any reading in the text. He did not put one reading in the text that was not found in a Greek manuscript. He's very clear about this. And so when people go, well, the last 6 verses of Revelation, I mean, maybe it's getting time to, if people really do still believe that, I'll debate them on that, because it's just this main like stronghold in people's minds that anytime you mention the book of Revelation, they go, but we've got the manuscript of Revelation and it doesn't have 6 verses at the end. And it's like, that's not the manuscript. It's so easy to understand this. How did, if it doesn't have from Revelation 16 to Revelation 21, if it doesn't have those verses, how did Erasmus spot homoioteiton, which is similar endings, in verse 19? If it doesn't have it. So it's obviously not the manuscript. And then they say, well, it actually departs all over the place in the book of Revelation from what Erasmus has and what he said. So Erasmus is a liar. The Textus Receptus is based upon a faulty foundation. Oh, we need a savior. And when Westcott and Hort turn up and go, okay, we'll fix this issue. It's just a load of rubbish. And this is, it makes more sense to go, well, what Franz Delitzsch has is not what Erasmus had. Then maybe he did have that. I'm questioning the whole concept of one manuscript for Revelation, because he does speak plurally about manuscripts. He says manuscripts plural. It wasn't in our manuscripts. When he's speaking about verse 19 of Revelation 22, he's talking about plural manuscripts. And so, all of these things have got to be questioned. And I think it's about time that we went through what the Academy are claiming with a fine-tooth comb, these type of bumper sticker, sayings that people just go, oh yeah, Erasmus, he rushed to print. Erasmus, he made a rash wager, promised that he would put the commentary in. All these sort of stuff just keeps getting parroted over and over and over. And you end up with a room of 100 parrots, but they're actually saying things that are just simply not true. And so we want to go through and verify everything. But anyway, that's my little rant. I'll get back to this, but let's just catch up with some of these comments. Okay, so Sifted Sands is in the house, says, I'm glad your week's been better on the inverse. Okay, so they're talking about vacations, having a good trip. So Hilly Billy had to bail. Helg says, defend what's right, critique what's wrong, no matter who is wrong or right. It's just common sense and biblical sense and scholarly sense. Well, I think the thing is, people go, well, Peter Ruckman said this and he's my hero, and it's like, it just doesn't look good when you're repeating stuff that's wrong. People are like, whatever. But the same goes for James White. If I say James White said this, people are like, how dare, and I've just gotten to the point where I did go to the point where I was like, I don't think this guy's saved, especially when my unsaved family were like, this guy's saying this about you and that about, and they were following it. And they were going, he's slandering you, he's lying. And they know what it means to be a Christian. They've seen me convert from being just a total bozo to like, I'm trying the hardest in my life not to lie, not to steal, I'm trying to do the right thing, trying to live as a Christian. So that they've seen many people convert. They know what it's about. And then they just see one of America's leading apologists just going, Nick says equals, you're a Ruckmanite, you are a psycho, you're this, you're that, and just saying 100 things about me that are just untrue. They're like, is this guy still like a Christian? Or I'm like, oh, well, what am I going to say to them? It's just easy to go, no, he's not, isn't it? And that's just that tax personally, let alone all the rubbish that he's saying out there. But I think this is one of the things, what I've found because, I've always said probably 95% of proclaimed Christians out there are simply not. Lots of them are deceived. And when you go out street preaching, you run into these people. You're out there street preaching, people come up and attack you, and they're the youth pastor of some church. And, and you're just saying John 3:16, for God so loved the world, you're there with your mic, they come along and they attack you and say, you shouldn't be doing this. And it's like, why not? But you just realize that a lot of these religious people, and what I've found is a lot of these people who have grown up in church, they get used to lying in the youth group and lying to their parents and lying to the pastor and hiding things. And so when they get older, they're scammers, they're schemers. And it's like coming from atheism, where I thought we came from a monkey, and drinking and taking drugs and all that, and then going, okay, it's darkness to light. And then it's like running into these people who were scheming and scamming. Oh, it's only a little lie, and I can just say whatever I want about you. I can just slander you. And it's like, aren't you interested in what the Bible says about this? They're just simply not. And so oftentimes I find the most antagonistic people are the religious crowd. And some of the people who hate the truth about this topic grew up and went to youth group, went to a whole bunch of other things, and that they've actually learned a religious. I'm not saying this is for everyone. Some people grow up in Christian circles and become, a lot like Christ, but a lot of people become like the Pharisees. So anyway, I'm sort of diverting. But yeah, great comment, Helg. Got me thinking. And so Hannah is just fully quoting Latin there, and so he's going to summon up a goat in a minute. A goat's about to appear on the live stream. Dwayne Green says, hey, yo. And you guys can't see me. You can just see the thing. So I might just pop my head in there for a sec. Hannah says, so James White is the embodiment of Latin. Interesting. So yeah, good to see you, Dwayne. Bold as a Lion says, good morning, Nick, and brothers and beautiful people. Dwayne Green says, David Brown, in his New King James Version, castigized the Latin Vulgate for a number of things, and then said it shouldn't be relied upon for readings. Yeah, well, I think the critical text guys pretty much had the same type of venom and hatred towards the Latin. So I guess I was trying to bring this out in the introduction, that the chick track style of Latin bad, Greek good. I understand Greek is primary and Latin is secondary, but oftentimes it's like, oh, Latin Vulgate bad, Latin this bad, Latin that bad. Anything Latin is just like, you may as well have summoned up a demon. And so I think it's an unhealthy thing. And I guess, the Byzantine priority, sometimes the critiques are they're not really looking at the Latin at all. And any type of reading that is, okay, we've got a reading here in Latin. Oh, it's weak in the Greek, like I said, the Commuhanium or whatever. It's like, oh, well, Latin is just something that we just simply will not go to, will not look at. And so sometimes the animosity to the Latin can just be as much as, it's Roman Catholic or whatever, where Latin was just the common language of the people, vast majority of people in Europe for quite a long time. And then it's sort of, most of those languages just morphed into something different, Spanish and, French and German and Italian and even English. Obviously we have a few different roots, but Latin is the foundation of Europe. And so to sort of throw the Latin out, it's a huge witness. And the thing is, in the Latin, we know that just the whole concept of the Textus Receptus, we know that the Latin became corrupted in certain parts. And so that's why Erasmus, he went back, looked at commentaries, earlier works, and went, hang on, there's differences here. And he was trying to work with that. But that same thing happened in Greek as well. So that's why you can't just go, okay, it's Greek. To me, just going Greek only, and and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we just go with Latin readings. What I'm saying is Greek as evidence only, and not even looking at Latin, not even looking at anything else, that can be just as detrimental as the Roman Catholics just having only Latin only, where we should have Greek as a primary, but then we should look at everything and examine everything. So that's my point of view anyway. Okay, so Sifted Sand says, faithful saints that preserve God's words are liars, while faithless heretics who attack God's words always tell the truth. The logic of modern critical text supporters. A. Hannah says, his manuscript of Revelation was lost in the 16th century, and they found a manuscript 200 plus years later and said that that was it. Yes, so that's what 300 years after Franz Delitzsch had this manuscript of Revelation, he's like, this is it. And so that's why people always just go back to that and say, oh, the book of Revelation has so many variants, it has so many problems, it has this and has that, because they're looking at that as Erasmus's source, where it can be easily proven that it's not. And it's just because the Sanhedrin have said that this is the way it is, or the magisterium has spoken, the textual criticism guys in Munster have said this. So we just have to go, okay, well, they think that that's the manuscript, so it is, you know. And how do we explain Erasmus's annotation saying one thing, but this manuscript doesn't even have those verses in it? Like, imagine I wrote a commentary on the Apocrypha of the King James, but I didn't have the Apocrypha in my edition of the King James. Where am I getting the readings from? So this is the thing. It's like, if Erasmus is writing about Revelation 22:19 and talking about the details that he saw in the manuscript, and he's talking about that's the only place that he went to the Latin there, the only place, and he asked his friends to correct it. Why then is this whole narrative that Erasmus all the way through his editions just, well, we're going to the Latin? It's just it's a lie, and it's deceptive, and this is from hell. It's just not true. And so anyway, Matt Singleton said the only testimony James White gave, from what I know, is that his parents told him Jesus took the spanking for me. Okay. Bible Highlighter says, I was actually going to do a write-up refuting the idea that the Reams was used for the King James Version. I think it's one of those things where when they were doing the translation of the King James, they had the ability to go to Tyndale and pretty much everything. They went to German sources. They went to a whole bunch of things. Now, what's the chance if a bunch of Catholics have done an edition, okay, what's the chance that then when they're going through their studies, they're like, well, this is the best word for that. And it so happens to be that the exact same. Do they just go, oh, no, we can't use that word anymore because the Douay Reams has it, we better change it? No, they just go with the most appropriate word, regardless of the Douay Reams. But the thing is, too, they would have looked at the Douay Reams. They would have gone through and gone, okay, well, that's saying it correctly. We're actually going to go with the same reading, not because of it, but it's just like that's, you know, some of the Catholic scholars were good. They knew what they were translating. Yeah, sometimes they did poor translation, but sometimes they did good translation. So yeah, I think it's a good, interesting thing to think about. Bible Highlighter says the claims do not stick. It's just another way to demonize the King James and say, like, people have several things that they say about the King James. It's like James White will go, oh, they had 3 different places where they had 2 companies. They had 6 different companies, like as if that's a problem. Wouldn't you think the more people that got involved, the more they could scrutinize the work? He's like, the more people got involved, it got out of hand and they didn't know what each other were doing. It's like, oh, okay. And then you've got people go, well, it's not actually a Bible translation. It comes from the Bishop's Bible, the 1602, blah, blah, blah. But they clearly said they went to the Greek and Hebrew. It's a translation, but they were to use the Bishop's Bible as like a draft. And so, but they were to amend that according to the Greek and Hebrew. And so it's like, let's not reinvent the wheel here. We've already got a good wheel. Let's do a translation, but we'll base it around that. It's still a translation. They actually say it's not a translation. Like there's just so many deceptions and lies about the King James, and this is just one of them. Oh, the Latin Vulgate's in there. Erasmus just put Vulgate readings everywhere. It's just a lie. And the more that I hear this, and the more people double down on this, in my mind, I just go, well, they're just not interested in truth, really. Matt Singleton said, the only testimony James White gave, from what I know, is that his parents told him Jesus took the spanking for me. Okay. Bible Highlighter says, anyway, good day to everyone here in Jesus' name. Blessing to you too, Highlighter. Dwayne Green says, we all know that if we look at Ruckmanite in the dictionary, there's a picture of you there. Yeah. Well, apparently, according to, what's his name? Joseph Armstrong, he's like, well, I'm a Ruckmanite. I got my beliefs from Gail Riplinger, apparently. I'm like, okay, so I'm sort of moving away from just allowing people to slander me like that, and just call them out and say you're actually being just as deceptive as Gail Riplinger by saying that type of rubbish. But Bible Highlighter is saying, thank you, Sifted Sands. So I'll just skip over some of that. Latin is secondary to confirm the original readings. Yes. Yeah, so the Latin can be very helpful. Bible Highlighter says, do you believe the King James Bible came from the Vulgate or Reams? So I'm guessing that you're talking to me. I don't think they came from the Vulgate or the Reams. I think it comes from the Greek. The Vulgate and the Reams can back up readings. And so obviously the Reams is just basically the Latin in a translation. Even if we were look at some of the worst, or just say I was to get an ESV, there's going to be some agreement with the ESV and the King James. Even it might have happened inadvertently, but it's because a lot of the text is the same. And so just someone says revolution is okay, and the Holy Bible is more than. Revelation is okay, sorry, and the Holy Bible is more than sufficient. Just someone says revolutionary. Okay. Bible Highlighter says, I hear the traffic in the background, Nick. Are those motorcycles? I'm not sure. I think I was having a rant and I didn't notice what was going on. So in Brazil, it can be loud. Okay. So, Bible Highlighter says, yes, looked at the Reams, but I believe it was secondary, not primary, or the only source. Yes, the King James guys looked at the Reams, and they would have looked at everything. They would have looked at, the good, the bad, the ugly. That there would have been translations back then that were done by weird people. There would have been some rubbish editions, and so, but they just looked at everything. So Sifted Sand says there's a lot of repeating of information without verification. It's a struggle to answer the same attacks against the TR and King James Version over and over again. But if that's what we're called to do, we do. Just someone says there's no King James Version. There's the Holy Bible. That's the Bible. Okay. So let's just continue through this. I'll have a sip of my drink. So the title, the subtitle, A Common Misconception of the Latin Vulgate. Many unskilled readers see the word Latin and immediately assume it is speaking of something Catholic and corrupt. So that's one of the things that I wanted to bring out. People go, if it's Latin, it's evil. Where what if it's agreeing 100% with what the Greek says? Well, it's actually an attestation. It's proof of that reading. So, and sometimes what I find is people, when they're doing a study, if they can just prove that there's early Latin attestation, but there's not early Greek attestation, they're like, see, and it's like it just having like a genetic line back to something Latin makes it evil or makes it a corruption, where it's like, well, couldn't the Latin actually be reflecting what was in the Greek? And so oftentimes this was the scholarship of Erasmus, Stephanus, Beza, the King James guys. They knew this. They knew that it wasn't, and especially living in Europe, most of us, most people who watch this live in America, but there's Australians. I'm in Australia. And like living in Europe, they would have, most of these people in England traveled Europe. They went over to France and Germany, and they went to Italy, and like someone like Erasmus, he was all over the place. He was in England for quite a few years. Then he's in Venice, he's in Rome, then he's in Switzerland, he's in France. He's all over the place, And so the whole concept and the weight of the influence of Latin is just everywhere. You go to a library, any old book's in Latin. And so to sort of dismiss that as just sort of like no evidence because it's evil or it's Catholic, it's like, no, I guess it's like if I said all the Greek is just Greek Orthodox. Now, I guess sometimes when we're trying to summarize things, we can, it can look like we're saying that, but it's a lot more complicated. And there are certain periods of time when the church was very influential over people, but then there were times when people wrote things and they were quite free to write things. And so we can't just demonize a whole language. We have to look at everything. So Dr. David Brown, president of the King James Bible Research Council, elaborates, don't make the mistake that many people make. When they hear the word Latin used in conjunction with the Bible or church, they automatically assume that it is to be associated with the Roman Catholic Church. So very good point, and I'm in agreement here. However, this is not true, because in northern Italy, the Italic Church had begun in AD 120, according to Theodore Beza, the associate and successor of John Calvin, the great Swiss reformer. Its remoteness isolated from the influence of the Church of Rome, the Italic Church was the forerunner of the churches of this same region, which would later be called the Valdus or the Waldensians. Both of these names simply mean people of the valleys. The Italic or pre-Waldensian Church produced a version of the New Testament which was translated from the received text by the year 157 AD. The noted church historian Frederick Nolan confirms this. This date is less than 100 years after most of the books of the New Testament were written. The greater point is that the Itala or Old Latin was translated from the received text, indicating its existence in the earliest days of the New Testament church. There, the received text clearly existed and was used by churches in early church history. So this is page 92 to 93, The Indestructible Book by David Brown. And so there is a little bit of, so I would agree with what's being said there. Some of the history of the Waldensians, I know that it's a popular thing for people like James White and others to say that, well, the King James only movement comes from Seventh-day Adventists. And so people, what they'd love to do is to make out that all that we are saying now comes from a 7-day Adventist. It's just this genetic fallacy. And yeah, it's absolute rubbish. But there were some authors who had talked about things about the Waldenses, the Waldensians, and they did quote from a 7-day Adventist guy. So this 7-day Adventist guy, he wrote a book defending the King James. And so in the 1930s, so some people had quoted him pretty much sort of like verbatim. And then what they do is they do this genetic fallacy where it goes, D.A. Waite quotes this other guy's book and he's quoting this 7-day Adventist guy. So it's 7-day Adventism sort of thing. It's this strange sort of beeline that goes through to a cult, So we've got our roots in a cult, Instead of we're free thinking people. We can evaluate the data. We don't have to. I guess it's a bit like someone just looking at Wikipedia and going, "Wow, that's true," and then you look at who put that post there on Wikipedia or that information. Oh, he was a Jesuit. So I got my information from a Jesuit. Well, the thing is, if it's true, it's true. If it's not, it's not. And so at the end of the day, whether if a 7-day Adventist came and said all this stuff about the King James, that has to be either proven or disproven, because he might have said a whole bunch of stuff that's correct, but he might have said a whole bunch of stuff that's wrong too. So that's where I just sort of bring that up, that sometimes the critical text guys try and make out that we're all influenced by this 7-day Adventist guy. And he talked a lot about the Waldensians and things like that. So usually that's something that when the Waldensians are mentioned, my cringe radar goes, it's like the kooky side of the Ruckmanite, Riplingerite sort of stuff. I sort of hear the bells of that sort of in my ears. But at the end of the day, too, Theodore Beza, he had a lot to do with the Waldenses, and he in France, he was quite influential in helping people against Roman Catholic persecution. There were people who basically joined the Reformation who were from the ancient Waldensian churches. And so Theodore Beza wrote quite a lot about this. And so what seems to happen is questionable people tend to hover around a certain topic, okay? So say it's like 1 John 5:7, you got, what's his name? Grantley MacDonald. He's an atheist. He doesn't like the King James or whatever. And he hovers around 1 John 5:7, and it's like you sort of just have to deal with his stuff because he wrote so much about it. So pretty much all you really have to do to make someone a cult in the future, you just be a bit of a weirdo. You write a whole bunch of stuff about something, and then someone in the future, when they reference back to you, it's like, well, you're related to me somehow. And that's what we see is anyone who sort of talks about the Waldensians, pre-Waldensian church, the Italia Bible, it's like 7-day Adventism. That this type of thing just comes up with critical text guys. So anyway, I just sort of mentioned that, even though it's got really nothing to do with what we're talking about here. So, and not that I saw that in David Brown's stuff. I guess there's some history here that I'm not that sure of. And I guess what I'm saying is be careful that you're not just going, who was it? Otis Fuller? I think I've got his book here. So God wrote one Bible. I know that's Jasper James Ray. So some of these guys were quoting the 7-day Adventist guy. But that whole concept's been thoroughly refuted as well. So, but I just thought I'd mention that. So Calvin George counts on the ignorance of his audience by not informing his readers of the fact that not all Latin texts were bad. but then many texts were good. He can get away with creating a false narrative that the King James Version is riddled with critical text readings, since the King James translators leaned heavily upon Latin evidence for their work. The truth is that although the King James translators had access to Jerome's Latin Vulgate, which was the Roman Catholic's Latin Bible for many years, it was not the only Latin source available to them, as we'll prove. There are over 10,000 Latin manuscripts in existence. Most of these are pure manuscripts that reflect pure original Greek readings that would later be collected into the Textus Receptus. Okay. So just looking at that statement, there's 10,000 Latin manuscripts. Yes, I agree with that. Most of these are pure manuscripts. I think sometimes saying that something's 100% pure, because it's sort of like they're pure manuscripts, sometimes they can have good and bad. So sometimes they can have errors in them. And see, then someone from the critical text side, all they have to do is go, well, this Latin manuscript has this reading that you don't agree with. It's not a TR reading. So is that a good manuscript or a bad manuscript? So that's where the critical text guys would go. And I guess if you were to just translate those Latin manuscripts just into English, what would you get? So especially if there's 10,000 of them, it's quite a lot. So it does say most. It doesn't say all, but they reflect pure original Greek readings. Yes, I guess I would probably rephrase that and go, most of these are pure. I wouldn't say they're pure manuscripts. I would say most of these texts do contain readings that are akin to the original Greek in many places. Because I guess then what can happen is you get the two-stream thing where people are going, okay, this is a good manuscript and that's a bad manuscript, where it's more so like you got to look at all the details. Just proclaiming something's good, then people look at the details and go, oh, it's got this bad reading in it. You said it was good, sort of thing. So that's where I would be careful with just that statement there. So, most of these are pure manuscripts that reflect the pure original Greek readings that would later be collected into the Textus Receptus. So I think too that's saying I was thinking he's talking about 10,000 Latin, and then the conclusion is that they would later be collected into the Textus Receptus. I think probably emphasize more that last statement is reflecting back to the Greek here rather than the Latin, because how this can be read is there's 10,000 Latin manuscripts. These are pure. They reflect the original Greek readings, and these 10,000 manuscripts will later be collated into the Textus Receptus. So I guess I would probably reword that. And I think if sorry if I've forgotten your name, Emmanuel Rodriguez. If Emmanuel does watch this, I would just say that one little bit. I would just word that a little bit. I understand what you're saying there, and I would be in agreement with what you're saying, that there's 10,000 manuscripts. Many of these have readings that are akin to the Greek that later would become be compiled and become the printed Textus Receptus. Reading it that way, I can see that, but it takes a while, and reading back over it to get that. And so I guess it could be worded a tiny bit better. So yeah, but I mean, that's my only critique so far, I think. The word Vulgate means common. The term Latin Vulgate is a reference to the Latin Bible texts that were in common use among the average common Latin-speaking Christians of earlier times. In his book, God only wrote one Bible. It was just the one that I was holding up. This one here. And so I guess in a way, like I've got this here, I'm pretty sure I've skimmed through it. Like this is a 1980 edition. I guess, yeah, some things can be very simplistic. And back before the internet, you've just got to really question some things. I'm not saying it's in error, but I guess, Emmanuel's probably done his homework and just checked this. Okay, so let's look at this. God wrote only one Bible. J.J. Ray wrote on page 99. These texts of the oldest Bibles of the Roman province is known as the Old Latin. This Old Latin was known as the Latin Vulgate many years before the days of Jerome, 340 to 420 AD. This term Latin Vulgate, referring to the Old Latin, which was translated from the received text, was not replaced until April the 8th, 1546, when at the Council of Trent, Jerome's Revised Latin was declared to be the authentic Bible of the Roman Church. Since then, the term Latin refers not to the Old Latin in harmony with the received text, but to the Revised Latin of Jerome. Okay. Okay, so let's just keep reading through because he's going to explain what he's saying here. So take notice that the term Latin Vulgate was used as a reference to the received text family of Old Latin texts for centuries before the Catholic Church demanded for it to refer only to Jerome's text. Do you think that true Bible-believing Latin-speaking Christians who oppose the Catholic Church complied with the demands of the Council of Trent? Would you? Of course not. They would have continued referring to their Latin Bibles, which would have been purer than Jerome's Catholic text, as the true Latin Vulgate. Okay. I guess the one thing that would have to be proven here is that they did call this the Latin Vulgate. My understanding is that older Latin was not just one edition. It was many different editions of the Latin. So you've got people all around the world, they're not copying each other's Latin text, although they might have done that in certain places, but they're actually creating their own Latin. And so they're translating things on one side of the empire, and on the other side, they're translating it a different way, but they're organically translating. Whether they're going from Latin into Latin or from Greek into Latin, but there's just lots and lots of these old Latin editions. Okay, so I would be in agreement with that. Council of Trent changed this, but what's interesting in Theodore Beza and Tremelius, who was a Jewish guy, he knew Hebrew fluently and did the Syriac Bible in 1569, and also Eunice, he spoke Arabic. These three guys worked together on a Latin edition of their own. So it's basically like the Protestants' Latin edition, and it was sort of just known as Beza's one, but he had these other guys working on it as well, and that became the Latin translation for the Protestants for about 300 years, until they had their own sort of like Westcott and Hort type of thing happen. And it's like, oh no, we're going to throw that out. And so there was a competing Latin one in the Reformation period. But I'm not really sure about this whole thing of it being called the Vulgate. So I would, but I guess in a way, I'm not exactly sure how scholarly this is. It's got lots of charts and things like that in it. But anyway, he has the page 99. Maybe I can even look at that. Let's read it. Page 99. Okay, so I'll just show you the context here. Okay, so page 99. Old Latin Vulgate agrees with the received text. Okay, so let's sort of show you that. So for people who want to pause that and go back through it. Okay, so this is quoting Frederick Nolan, Burgon and Miller, Catholic Encyclopedia, Gregory, Canon of the New Testament. So he does have quite a lot of footnotes there backing up certain things. Then he's got a whole section on the Council of Trent. Okay. So maybe it's actually me. Maybe I'm ignorant of some of this material and I need to come up to speed with it. So anyway, let's just continue. Okay, so take notice the term Latin Vulgate was used as a reference to the received text family of Old Latin texts for centuries before the Catholic Church demanded for it to refer only to Jerome's text. Do you think true Bible-believing Latin-speaking Christians who opposed the Catholic Church complied with the demands of the Council of Trent? Would you? Of course not. They would have continued referring to their Latin Bibles, which would have been purer than Jerome's Catholic text, as the true Latin Vulgate. Okay. So very interesting. And I guess I need to come up to speed with, I guess, the pre-Erasmus Latin text, the Vulgate, and even the concept of being called the Latin Vulgate and things like that, and the influence of the Council of Trent. Do you see the confusion that the Catholic Church caused? 1 Corinthians 14:33, God is not the author of confusion. The Catholic Church of Trent hijacked the term Latin Vulgate. Since then, we now have a title that is applicable to two different Bibles. The corrupt Latin text of Jerome on one hand, the pure Latin text of earlier non-Catholic Christians on the other. Nowadays, Christians get the two texts mixed up in discussions. Usually they assume that any reference to the Latin is a reference to Jerome's Catholic text. Yeah, and I guess I would be in agreement with that. I guess where I'm sort of going backpedaling a little bit is just the concept that people called it the Latin Vulgate. I'm sort of like, and I can see perhaps it was hijacked. Perhaps I need to learn this. And that's why I'm reading through this. I'm reading through this not just to critique it, but to learn, you know. So I'll definitely think about that. And I know I've listened to Phil Stringer talk about the Latin Bible and the Old Latin, and how I think he was in Europe at one time, and he was talking about the Waldensian Bible with someone, and they were saying that it is not related to Jerome's text, but the older Latin text, which is closer to the Textus Receptus and all this sort of stuff. And so I can't remember the exact video, but I do remember going through that a few times, trying to understand what's going on there. Okay, so basically what's being said here is that at the Council of Trent they said this is the Latin Vulgate, and not making a distinction between the Jerome's text and the earlier Latin text. But to me, Jerome's text actually has a lot more to do with the Textus Receptus than people acknowledge. And also, I guess the Old Latin, which people can see as just like a one sort of thing, a bit like the Vulgate, but it was all different types of text. I guess it's like looking at the Reformation English Bibles. That is all different. You know, there's the bishops, there's the Geneva, and perhaps they influence each other. And we know the English ones did, but perhaps the Latin ones influence each other. Perhaps they didn't. So you can have all these differences. But that's a whole school of thought of going into the Latin and seeing what is related to the Textus Receptus, how old these old Latin manuscripts are. And I know the 157 Itala date. I guess some of these manuscripts have to be re-looked at. And I guess because sometimes there's ignorance about it, and sometimes there's this mystical air about it where we're quoting these things. As I know, I say this stuff as well. On the front page of my website, I've got, the Atala Bible, because I think it was D.A. Waite in his book. He has a whole list of, TR sort of influenced Bibles. But it's like, okay, where is their agreement? Where is their departure? And also the thing is too, sometimes when critical text people do this work, they can just read into stuff and go, well, I don't think it's saying this. I think it's saying this other thing. And they constantly push toward their presupposition. So it would be good to go back to the earliest Latin text and go, okay, well, how does this match with the Textus Receptus? Okay, so that Bible-believing Christians of the past rejected Jerome's corrupt Latin Bible and continued to use the purer Old Latin Bibles is confirmed on the front page of the website for the Vetus Latina Institute. Okay, as Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire in the first centuries after Christ, it became necessary to produce Latin versions of the Bible for those not able to understand the Greek of the New Testament or Septuagint. The first translations were made by individual Christians for use within their own community. These are known as the Old Latin or Vetus Latina. Toward the end of the 4th century, Pope Damascus asked the scholar St. Jerome to produce a revised version of the Gospels, along with Jerome's translation of the Old Testament, an anonymous revision of the rest of the New Testament, and a handful of books from other sources. These later became a standard version, the Vulgate. The Vulgate took many years to become established as the principal Latin Bible. In the meanwhile, the Old Latin versions, so that's good, they've got a plural there. That's one of the things that gets people in trouble when they say it's just like this Old Latin, like it's all exactly the same. It's versions that they do have differences. Continue to be used. Some of these translations are preserved in Bible manuscripts, in the writings of the Church Fathers, and the early Christian liturgies. These texts are of great significance for the history of the Church and the transmission of the Bible. Most of the Old Latin translations were made from Greek manuscripts which no longer exist. Although the Latin texts have undergone their own process of transmission, the original layer preserves a witness to the Bible, especially in the New Testament, which would otherwise be lost to us. Okay, so that's very interesting, and it's got the link there to the vetuslatina.org website. Okay, so that's a very good point. These guys are basically saying the same thing, and they're saying that there is witness to a lot of readings in these earlier Latin texts. I guess one thing that I would be careful of is saying that Jerome's text was sort of like completely corrupt and it's on the bad list sort of thing, where it's sort of like some of the what would be labeled as Vulgate readings are King James TR readings, but then you look at another text, like even within, say, like Beatus of Libana or Hamo Halberstadensis, and these guys have their Latin text and a commentary. Sometimes they have the correct reading in their commentary, but not in their main text. But then you'll get another edition like 100 years later, and it's reversed, and so sometimes the Vulgate wasn't as concrete as people make out either. There were diversions from that and changes and variations of that as well. So. Yeah, interesting topic though. Let's continue. So, okay, so I just read through that. So Jack Mormon states in his excellent book on manuscript evidence entitled Forever Settled that the very word Vulgate was falsely used by Jerome. Okay. To elaborate upon this statement, Mormon then quotes Benjamin. So this is the thing. Benjamin Wilkinson is the Seventh-day Adventist guy. So this is where it's like, okay, well, it's not really noted here, and this is one of the things where in the scholarship that I'm doing, I'm like, we've just got to be careful who we're quoting, and especially these type of quotations. Someone from Benjamin Wilkinson, I'm not sure if Emmanuel knows that he's an SDA guy, but the thing is, maybe Benjamin Wilkinson is correct on this as well, regardless of him being a cult guy. And the thing is, what absolute hypocrisy by the critical text guys. They have a Unitarian working like a cult member, working on the text. If Benjamin Wilkinson is just an apologist saying, I like the King James and I think I can back it up, blah, 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 and he's in a cult, the Seventh-day Adventist, that doesn't mean he's affecting the text at all. These guys have cult members working on the text. Having a cult member agree with stuff we say, then they're like, you're related to him. And it's like, no, he just agrees with what we're saying. It's like, I believe in the Trinity. Just because a Catholic, just because the Pope believes in the Trinity doesn't mean I believe in the papacy. You know what I mean? And the Pope can say things that are correct too about the Trinity, So anyway, let's read Benjamin Wilkinson. Now, one person who's done a bit of work on Benjamin Wilkinson is Stephen Avery. So if you want to look into the whole SDA apologist guy, and unfortunately what's happened through the years is people have quoted this guy quite a lot. So that's where it comes from Seventh-day Adventism, to demonize me, you, like we're all just duped and we're all of a sudden going, oh, it's not because, the Westcott and Hort text is just trash and it's just, this weird Frankenstein monster and all the rest of it. It's because we've been duped by Seventh-day Adventists sort of thing. So the word Vulgate means commonly used or current. This word has been appropriated from the Bible, to which it rightfully belongs, and given to the Latin Bible of Jerome. It took hundreds of years before the common people would call Jerome's Latin Bible a Vulgate. So I would definitely have to check that and see if that's legitimate. But it could be. Since Italy, France, and Great Britain were once provinces of the Roman Empire, the first translations of the Bible by early Christians in these parts were made into Latin. The early Latin translations were very dear to the hearts of those primitive churches, and as Rome did not send any missionaries toward the west before 250 AD, the early Latin Bibles were well established before those churches came into conflict with Rome. Not only were such translations in existence and well established before the Vulgate was adopted by the papacy, but the people for centuries refused to supplant their own Latin Bibles by the Vulgate. God, in his wisdom, invested these Latin versions by his providence with a charm that outweighed the learned artificiality of Jerome's Vulgate. For 900 years, we are told, the Old Latin held its own after the Vulgate appeared. The critical version of Jerome never displaced it. It only replaced it when the Latin ceased to be a living language. Okay. So that was Benjamin Wilkinson. So probably a big thing in this, because this is a defense of the King James, it's King James Bible Research Council, people need to know who this guy is, because you're quoting Jack Mormon 1 minute, and Jack Mormon's quoting Benjamin Wilkinson. And so this has been one of the problems, is people are saying, okay, but I guess maybe Jack Mormon does have a caveat and say, hey, this guy's on this side of the fence when it comes to church denominations. I think they're a cult, they're legalists. You have to go to church on Saturday or else you're taking the mark of the beast and all this sort of weird stuff. But, a broken clock could be right twice a day as well. The point is, whenever someone says that the Latin Vulgate was used in the King James Version, This should not be seen as a bad thing. Okay. There are two types of Latin Bibles referred to as the Latin Vulgate. A very good one and a not as good one. Okay, that's a good description. A very good one and not as good one. And I guess I've got to, my own homework, I've got to make sure that the old Latin is very good, because I'm just relying on scholarship telling me. I'm not denying that Jerome's Vulgate was consulted by the King James Version translators. What I'm pointing out is that when it would have been compared with pure Latin text that the King James Version translators had in front of them. Also with every other TR-friendly resource they were working with. Anything influenced by the Latin Vulgate would have been in agreement with the overall evidence of the traditional text that the King James Version was based on. Yeah, so I mean, primarily they just went to the Greek. They went to the Greek of Theodore Beza. The whole thing of Latin influence is pretty ridiculous. But I mean, the whole society was influenced by Latin, and so it's sort of like us trying to separate English from Anglo-Saxon or something. It's like, oh, that's an Anglo-Saxon reading. It's satanic, and it's like, well, that's what our language is based on. Of course, there's going to be etymological links to Latin in English. What kind of Latin Bible influenced the King James Version readings? Calvin George wants his readers to believe that the Latin Vulgate readings in the King James Version were only that of the corrupted kind rather than that of the pure Latin Bibles of the non-Catholic Christians. If this is true, it would allow him to argue that it is otherwise okay for a little bit of critical text to be sprinkled in the Reina Valera Bible. However, the Bible says in Galatians 5:9, a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. We prefer 100% pure Bible. We don't want one sprinkled with a little bit of corruption. A little bit of corruption is way too much. Jesus said in Matthew 4:4, man should not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. Therefore, we need a Bible with all of God's words, not one with some of his words missing due to a sprinkling of the critical text. In regard to his words, God promised purity and preservation in Psalm 12:6-7, not a sprinkling of corruption. One individual who was against corruption was Desiderius Erasmus, the father of the Textus Receptus. Everyone knows about his Greek New Testament, which paved the way for the development of the received text that ultimately resulted in the making of the King James Bible. The King James Version was the crowning work of the Textus Receptus. Many don't think much, however, about the fact that Erasmus's text not only included God's word in Greek, it included his own Latin translation as well. Erasmus was a reformer. He wanted to reform the Roman Catholic Church. Part of his strategy to do so was to provide a Latin Bible that was more pure than Jerome's Latin Vulgate. In fact, the picture below, we have Erasmus's fourth edition of the Textus Receptus published in 1527. Notice it has three texts parallel to each other, his Greek text and his own Latin translation and Jerome's Latin Vulgate. Okay, so let's look at this. So yeah, here we have the book of John. I'm pretty sure that's 3rd John. Yes, so Johanna, and it's got Gamma, which means it's the 3rd John. And just says Erasmus, that's Erasmus's Latin edition in the middle. And this is the Vulgate edition there. So for scholars in those days, most of them could read Latin. They would have read through this Latin and probably learned Greek as they were going along, reading these parallels. And then they're able to check what the Vulgate said here. So here we have the introduction, the prologue to Jude. And so this is the prologue to Jude here. But you can clearly see it has the Greek, it has a Latin translation, and then it has a Latin Vulgate as well. So, so this is the 4th edition of the Greek and Latin New Testament of Desiderius Erasmus. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to finish the thought here, and then I'll just quickly zip up to where he's talking about Erasmus and just say a few other things about Erasmus, but I don't want to just have my own opinion over this, because I know he's trying to make a point with the Latin. Sometimes I can rabbit trail off and talk about a whole bunch of other stuff, but I only want to just bring up a few things. So why was Jerome's Vulgate included beside Erasmus's personal Latin translation in this edition? Obviously, they were there for comparison. Erasmus wanted to show that his Latin text was better. The Greek text was there to demonstrate that the original text, what the original Greek text would have looked like. In other words, Erasmus wanted to show that his Latin translation was more faithful to the original text than that of Jerome's. Excuse me. So what I might do, I'll just quickly go up and finish my thoughts on what he was saying about Erasmus. So, so first off, Psalm 12, 6-7. Usually this gets brought up by critical text people when you say this is about preservation. It's clearly about preservation. But what happens is some people have an extreme view on this, where they think there's 7 English Bibles and the King James is the 7th. So that's the purest English Bible. And so they go through and they count these editions and say, see, there's 7 purified 7 times. It's talking about English, where it's simply just not. And so to me, when people say that, it's like, I just sort of roll my eyes and go, that's not what it's talking about. But that's usually what happens is there's a bit of a bait and switch there. Then someone like Mark Ward will bring this issue up and talk about, 7 purifications of English and all this. And I'm like, I don't believe that. I believe in preservation from that verse, but not the way that some people bring it across. Now, I'm pretty sure Emmanuel here doesn't believe that either. So he would be on my side there, but I'm not sure, so. But I just thought I'd bring that up. As soon as I see Psalm 12, I'm like, I have to have a bit of a caveat there. So he's mentioned Desiderius Erasmus. And yeah, so Erasmus was a reformer, so that's true. Even though Erasmus, he was trying to stay within the Roman Catholic system, it wasn't like we can look back in retrospect and say, well, Erasmus should have done this and should have done that. He actually praised Luther for a lot of things. I think the thing was Luther sort of did some good, but then he went off on a few tangents and people were like, that's weird. And things got rough. And some of these reformers, they wanted political revolution and war, and and so of course Erasmus is not going to tie himself to these people, and it's a new thing. It's just all of a sudden happened, and it's like, is Erasmus just going to join a group? You know what I mean? I think he had way more influence being in those circles and speaking with authority in those circles. I mean, later on, all of his books were put on the forbidden list, the prohibited books list of the Roman Catholic Church. So obviously he's not a friend of the Roman Catholic Church. Just read Praise of Folly. I mean, he wrote Praise of Folly when he was living with Thomas More in England. And Thomas More, he was definitely a Catholic, you know what I mean? But a lot of these things, he was just seeing corruption, and he was pointing out where there's problems. But it's like he still had corruption in him because he's surrounded by this. He grew up with it. Imagine growing. It's like when you meet someone and they've grown up a Jehovah's Witness or something. They've usually got some little tweaky thing that they can't get rid of or something. And it's like, Seventh-day Adventists, they've got this tweaky little thing, and it's like, these guys had that, but they were definitely heading in a certain direction. And he was so influential in England. He was teaching Greek there. I mean, he was in Oxford and Cambridge. Those two places that they were there going, okay, Erasmus used to teach here, and this is what he taught, and here are his books that he gave to us, and we, for 100 years we've read these books, and we've still got them here today. You know what I mean? Like Erasmus was a huge influence in the Church of England, but he wanted to reform the church just like Luther did from inside. Okay, so now one sort of, I guess it's not even a correction, but just sort of like a little bit of a detail. Part of his strategy was to provide a Latin Bible that was more pure than Jerome's Latin, and so that's true, but I would just nuance that and say, I think that Jerome's Latin, his original Latin, was way closer to the Greek, and that's what Erasmus was trying to provide. The Latin, as it had ended up, had certain readings in it that people were like, "Oh, that's a corruption. That's no good." And so that's what Erasmus was trying to conform the Vulgate to. But that's, I guess, that's my theory. I have to prove that. So anyway, I just sort of mentioned those things quickly about Erasmus. So why was Jerome's Vulgate included? And so it says here, the Greek text was there to demonstrate what the original Greek text would have looked like. In other words, Erasmus wanted to show his Latin translation was more faithful to the original than that of Jerome's. And so I would sort of nuance that and say than that of Jerome's as it was sort of portrayed in Erasmus's day, because I think Jerome's text had changed. And the thing is too, sometimes we see with what would be labeled as Vulgate, we do see differences between older editions and what we see today. And even now, if you look on the internet and type in Vulgate, it's weird. It's like that doesn't even match what they had in the Reformation period as labeled as the Vulgate, or even the Clementine Vulgate. The Clementine Vulgate is way closer to like a TR type of thing, even though it does differ and there are important differences. But yeah, I guess this is probably a whole nother area where there's a whole bunch of strange deceptions and rewordings and in the Latin, because so many, you basically have to be a scholar to know Latin. And so usually it's in the halls of academia where all these weird type of concepts come from. We know there's so much deception just in English speaking circles, let alone in Latin, where you're like, can you translate that for me? And they translate it, and it's like, doesn't seem literal. Or you read Jan Kranz's material where they're translating Erasmus, and it's like, that's not right. And then you find out it's completely wrong. It's deceptive, Okay, in his book, The Text of the King James Bible, Dr. Lawrence Vance quotes Erasmus and says, Erasmus considered his work to be written for the benefit of scholars and especially students of theology. He said in his Apologia that his Latin version was not meant to replace the Vulgate. For those who are fond of the Vulgate, their edition is still available for them to use. I neither change it nor condemn it. In fact, it is not spoiled by my revision, but rendered clearer, purer, and more accurate. Let the Vulgate be read in schools, changed in the churches, quoted in sermons. I think I can promise that whoever reads my version at home will better understand his own. Okay, so this is the Text of the King James Bible by Dr. Lawrence Vance, page 366. Notice Erasmus's desire for something clearer, purer, and more accurate. In Erasmus's fifth and final edition of the Textus Receptus, he removes Jerome's Latin Vulgate while maintaining his own. It should be obvious that Erasmus considered his Latin text to be superior than that of Jerome's. And again, I would put the caveat Jerome's of the Reformation period of Erasmus. As diplomatic as Erasmus tried to be about all this. The Roman Catholic Church did not take kindly to Erasmus's Greek and Latin New Testaments. Dr. Vance points out Erasmus's correction of the Vulgate was the catalyst that ultimately led to the swift success of the Reformation and the concomitant loss of the ecumenical authority of the Catholic Church, 363. The Roman Catholic Church never accepted Erasmus's work. Instead, they labeled him a heretic at the Council of Trent for doing a Greek and Latin New Testament without their permission, and for books he wrote which challenged Catholic doctrine. In reaction to Erasmus's work, a Catholic friar named Ambrosius Catharinus wrote, Erasmus planted, water-luthered, but the devil gave the increase. So I'm not sure if he did it without their permission. I'm pretty sure Pope Leo at the time, he was an academic guy. A lot of these guys knew each other personally. But yeah, that's the only thing that I could see there. But, you know, maybe it's a nothing. In 1559, Pope Paul IV placed Erasmus's name on the Catholic Church's public list of forbidden authors, the Index of Forbidden Books. For more information for the opposition of the Roman Catholic Church against the works of Erasmus, see David Brown's book, Desiderius Erasmus the Man, His Important Work, and Its Consequent Influence. We know that the King James translators had Erasmus's and Latin text in front of them when they did their work on the English Bible. We have indisputable evidence to demonstrate that the King James translators used Erasmus's Latin translation in their work on the King James Version. There is a book entitled Translating for the King, which is a collection of the personal notes of John Boyce, compiled by Ward Allen, concerning his works on the King James Version. On page 119 of the first edition, Boyce makes reference to all copies of Erasmus's Latin New Testament, which I have examined. Okay, so this is John Boyce's notes. All copies of Erasmus's Latin New Testament, which I have examined, show, and then it's got the reading here. But see Erasmus's note on this verse. Okay, that's a very interesting 1516. It's got Chrysostom here. I can't make that out. And CB's at 1598. So interesting. These are the notes of John Boyce. So I think I would enjoy very much having them. But let's continue. So, in fact, not only did the King James Version translators have Erasmus's Greek and Latin New Testaments, but they also had the New Testament text of Robert Estienne, also known as Stephanus, and Theodore Beza available to them. Guess what? Stephanus's and Beza's text also contained Latin translations. Stephanus reproduced Erasmus's Latin text, and Beza did one of his own. So when because I didn't read this whole article, I looked at this, and then I read, I think it was this little bit underneath here, and I was like, I wonder if, because I'm not really sure if Stephanus has had a Latin text. I know he's 1550 and 1551 don't, but perhaps he's 1546 or 1549 do, or perhaps he printed it as a separate volume, and that could well be exactly what happened. So, but yeah, I was just thinking of this, like, okay, Stephanus's work, he did these 4 editions. Was there a Latin text there? I'm pretty sure he was a very good printer. He probably would have done a Latin edition. So I was just thinking along these lines. Stephanus reproduced Erasmus's Latin text, and Beza did one of his own. And so, yeah, Beza did the definitive one that the reformers or people who were labeled Protestants used for the next 300 years. And basically, if you translated what Beza did into English, you would get the King James Version. There would be very little changed. John Boyce makes a reference to the Latin text of Erasmus, Stephanus, and Beza in his personal notes, proving that the TR Latin texts were indeed utilized in the King James Version. Yes. And so translations of Erasmus, Stephanus, Beza that match up with their Greek texts. From everything I read, it seems that Erasmus, Stephanus, and Beza all desired a purer Latin Bible to serve as the foundation for a reformation of the Roman Catholic Church. Looking back on history, Bible-believing Christians today understand that the Catholic Church is so corrupt that it was never going to be reformed. What men like Erasmus, Stephanus, and Beza did, however, with the contribution of their Greek and Latin New Testaments, was provide a basis that would instead serve as a foundation for a bunch of Reformation-era Bibles like that of Luther, Olivetan, Diodati, Rayner, and Valera. The King James Version translators and more that all made a great impact. The Reformers had one thing in mind, but God had something much greater in mind. Though through their valiant efforts and noble inventions, God's pure words went even further than they intended. Everyone knows that the King James Version translators were also Protestants. They opposed the Catholic Church. While it is true that they spoke respectfully about Jerome as a scholar in their preface, something that many Bible translators did as they believed they were simply giving credit where credit was due, they would not have approved of any Catholic corruption in the English text, considering their opposition against the Catholic Church. It would be far-fetched to believe that the 54 King James Version translators that assembled in 6 different groups would have accepted any critical text readings that would contradict the collective evidence of the Textus Receptus editions they were working with. So consider this statement in the preface of the King James Bible, so that if, on the one side, we shall be traduced by popish persons at home or abroad, who therefore will malign us, because we are poor instruments to make God's holy truth to be yet more and more known unto the people, whom they desire still to keep in ignorance and darkness. Notice the King James Version translators were expecting opposition by popish persons, the Roman Catholic Church. Why would they expect opposition from the Catholics if their Bible was sprinkled with Latin readings which reflect Jerome's Vulgate as opposed to the TR? Does that make any sense to anyone? Well, I guess even if it was a Protestant edition with Latin sprinklings in it, they probably still wouldn't be happy with it. So I guess, but yeah, anyway, let's continue. The overall point is that the sprinkling of Latin readings is not critical text influence on the King James Version, as Calvin George claims. The King James Version was influenced by more Latin evidence than just of Jerome's. Even if there was anything significant that may have been considered from Jerome's Vulgate, there is no proof that such things conflicted with the TR. Where is Calvin George's evidence that the King James Version translators chose readings from a critical text Latin Bible which departed from the TR? He has none. Okay. So then he goes on to talk about the 60. But what I'll do before I read that, I'm going to quickly go through some of these comments. Now, I've spoken for quite a while, so we're going way back. There's lots of comments. Now, let me try and get through these. I'll have a sip of my drink. Soka Preston asked me, what documented proof do we have that books like Hebrews was originally written in Greek. I'm pretty sure I've got material on my website that would talk about that, but maybe I don't. Sometimes I have material that I don't put on there. Okay, so originally written in Greek. Okay, so that would have to be for a study for another day, but off the top of my head, I can't really tell you. But yeah, good question. Just someone says, so are there only two main components and two main commands? What are they? Bible Highlighter says Erasmus and other TR architects had Latin translation next to their Greek printed editions. Next to the Greek reading, the printed editions. Just someone says, what are the two main characteristics of Christ? George Alexander says power and wisdom. Got to step out. So yes, 1 Corinthians 1:24, you talk too much. Just someone says, I shall tell you in plain English, never fall out with your brother and never worry about money. Helg Evanson says the Latin Bible started long before any Roman Catholic existed. So the Latin text is not Roman Catholic. It is just one of the ancient versions like Syriac. And that's one thing too. Like if you read Wikipedia, it's like Pope so-and-so in the 3rd century. And it's like, it's not really until like 600 that you start getting the whole concept of the Roman Catholic Church. Even in the earlier days, the Church of Rome were rebuking other churches for having just sort of like one pastor, one bishop, instead of having a group, and like sort of saying, sort of coming against the whole concept of like a papacy sort of thing. So George Alexander says, no, you're just making that up. I'm not sure who he's talking to. So Cal Preston says it shows their total ignorance of the history of the King James Bible movement. Okay, so just someone just seems to be like just saying rubbish, but Wilkinson quoted from Burgon. Okay, that's interesting. Vance has republished many KJV only books from 1800s. Okay, interesting. Just someone says versions or what? There is the Bible and there are verses or versions. So if he says any sort of more nonsensical things, I think I'll just throw him out. Christ is power and wisdom of God. SoCal Preston, Wilkinson's book is a must read though. The SDAs are the founders of the creation movement. Also, they were very healthy. I would say that SDAs, with their superstitious claims that you will not commit solitary vice, which is basically sex with yourself, if you will not commit that if you give up meat. So that was a whole vegetarian movement, which became a huge part of the food pyramid that we saw introduced in the last 100 years that has caused so many problems in society. But I would say the SDAs, half of Ellen G. White's writings are about solitary vice, and she used to break her own rules and go and eat meat and then repent of it. And half of her writings are about this. It's pretty strange. It's weird. They are a cult like the Seventh-day Adventists. Like the Jehovah's Witnesses. The earliest Seventh-day Adventists didn't believe in the Trinity. I've talked to SDAs who still believe Michael the Archangel is Jesus. And so I know others who don't, but I do know others who say they are. But anyway, so just someone says, nah, I'll stick. Okay. Sifted Sand says, I call what Nick is saying about SDA or other groups poisoning the well Just because an STA says something, that doesn't mean it's automatically false, but it is good by association from that point on. Yeah, and so, and the thing is too, what's to say that some person in a cult points something out, they're the first ones to write about it, and so it's like, oh, we're all going back to them. You know what I mean? And instead of 5 years later, people wrote about it and wrote similar things, and it's like, oh no, you got your ideas from this guy. It's like, oh, no, I independently thought about this. So they like to push us back to Ruckman. They like to push us to Wilkinson, but and the thing is, I've just sort of avoided the whole Wilkinson thing because, I think for myself, but at the end of the day, I probably should. It's like avoiding Ruckman or avoiding Replinger. It's like, okay, I've looked at enough of their stuff to go, I don't agree with them on plenty of stuff. But with Benjamin Wilkinson, it just seems like a weird sort of concept. It's like, you got your ideas from him, and it's like, I don't think so. But maybe what he's saying is true. Some people can say things that are true and they don't agree with us theologically. So SoCal Preston says Ruckman's bookstore sells Wilkinson's book. Okay, that's interesting. Just someone says, don't trip over the word, never fall out with your brother, never worry about money, leave the rest to go. I think I might just how do I here we go. I think I'll just ban him. That's it. That's better. Okay. George Alexander says, Preston, no, the wisdom of God that is written, Luke 11:49 KJV is referring to Christ, not the Holy Ghost. Read carefully. Helg says, Benjamin Wilkinson was an Adventist, Burgon was an Anglican baby sprinkler, Waite was a cessationist, and Jeff Riddle is a Calvinist. All of them have spoken truth. Can you imagine? Yeah, well, I guess at the end of the day, it's like believing in a type of science, I mean, you can be young earth creationist, but you can be a SDA, you can be a Jehovah's Witness, you can be a Catholic, you can be a Protestant, you can be a Baptist, you can be a Pentecostal, you can be, and it just gets to the point where it's like, oh, you're related to the Jehovah's Witnesses. That's where you get your creationist stuff from. And that's like people trying to make out that you're a Kent Hovind follower, and it's like, not really. George Alexander says the Hebrew and the Greek are false. Only Jerome, Tyndale, and Erasmus has the correct text of the Old Testament and New Testament. The Hebrew and the Greek are false. Only Tyndale. Okay, I'm not really sure about that. SoCal says Helg, the STA were the founders of the creation movement. So I'm not really sure about that. I know here in Australia, when Answers in Genesis were quite big, there were a lot of Seventh-day Adventists who were trying to promote their material through that movement and sort of co-opt that group. So Sifted Sand says, I can, just because someone has some wrong doctrine, even severely wrong, it doesn't mean they can't be led to good truth on other doctrines and topics. I'm thankful for those men, really. Okay. Shawnee says, if you doubt, go to the Geneva Bible. King James revised it. Geneva 1599 Bible, not the newer versions. Okay. Shawnee says the message of the Bible is clear. Jesus gave us 2 commandments: love our Father and each other. It's simple. He changed eye for an eye. He changed the divorce law. It's all about love. Why would anyone question it? Okay. So I'm going to skip over some of this stuff where it's not really talking about the discussion. Okay, so people are having a bit of a rumble in the chat. That's fine. SoCal Preston says, I have Wilkinson's book right in front of me. It's filled with footnotes. Okay. I would question everything Jack and Brown say. They're overrated KJV scholars. Okay, and so that's one of the things. Yeah, I'm going through the King James Bible Research Council. I question them and go through their stuff just like I would anyone else, and so. Okay, so King James is in the house. SoCal says Jesus spoke Aramaic. Yeah, that's fine, but he definitely the word of God that Paul wrote to Thessalonians would most probably not be in Aramaic or Hebrew, or it would have been in Greek, and so that's quite clear. Helg says, on multiple theological points, the non-Calvinists have more in common with Erasmus than with Luther and Calvin. Okay, that's interesting. And I think Luther and Calvin, they benefited from Erasmus quite a lot. Calvin especially, and his method of teaching was learned from Erasmus. So Bible Highlighter says, I will reveal my write-up on how the King James Version is not a direct copy of the Reams. Bible Highlighter says, yeah, SDA and LGY is not biblical. Okay, so let's continue with this article. So what about the 60 Latin Vulgate readings in the King James Version that Scrivener pointed out? I will not weary you by taking the time in this article to discuss the 60 Latin Vulgate readings that FHA Scrivener pointed out in the King James Version text. This was already done by Italian Bible translator named Christopher Yetzer, and you can read his fine treatment of this in the following link. So I know he's called Italian Bible translator. I actually didn't know that Chris Yetzer was doing a Bible translation. I assumed that he was just a missionary there, but he does know a lot about the Diodati text, and that would explain his fascination with a lot of these details. So we have this link here, and it looks like that goes to an article. I went to the RBG, the Gomez Bible Society. So that's by Yetzer. So yeah, missionary to Italy. I'm not sure if he's doing Bible translation, but yeah, so that's the other article I wanted to read. Now, I probably won't get through to this today because I've taken quite a long time on this other article. But I did go through that article, and it's quite well written. In Yetzer's article, he shows that word choices in the King James Version that may have been influenced by the Latin Vulgate are non-issues in regard to how different they might be from the way they are worded in the Greek Textus Receptus. For example, 7 of the 60 places has the word Beelzebub, Matthew 10:25, 12:24, 12:27, Mark 3:22, Luke 11:15, 18, and 19. The difference is in the spelling. The Textus Receptus has the word spelt with an L at the end instead of the letter B. So the TR is spelled in Greek as Beelzebul, while the Latin has Beelzebub. Yetzer explains, the evidence does not indicate that the King James translators blindly or solely relied on the Latin Vulgate. Rather, it is more likely that they considered the arguments of Beza, Erasmus, and their lexical sources. They may have also understood Jerome's reasoning and agreed that the name referred to the Old Testament god of the flies. Okay. I'll just keep reading through, because I don't think there's any difference between Beelzebub and Beelzebul. Beelzebub is the Latin way of saying it, but we say heaps of things in English that are the Latin way of saying it. Or we say something in Greek. We transliterate lots of things from Greek, and we like baptize. We just use baptize. Baptizo is in the Greek, and it's transliterated for the most part, but the end is changed a little bit. So having Beelzebub or Beelzebul, Beelzebub is just the Latin way of saying it, but that's how English people said it. Like even, what's it, that Queen song, Bohemian Rhapsody, where he says, Beelzebub has the devil put aside for me. It's like everyone uses Beelzebub. No one says Beelzebul, except for people who know Greek and scholars of the Bible. They might say Beelzebul. Where Beelzebub is, that's been known in English for, probably 600-700 years, probably going way back. And yes, it's influenced by the Latin, but it doesn't mean that it's from the Latin Vulgate. It means it's just a word that has been influenced by the Latin so much that English people just started using it. So what are you going to just go, oh, we can't use that word because it's got some sort of Latin etymology. We have to just change it to something no one uses. That's ridiculous. And so anyway, let's continue. Such insignificant differences are what Calvin George is calling departures from the TR. Folks, that is not a TR departure. It is the same word, just spelt differently from one language to another. And the author of this, Emmanuel, he's fluent in Spanish. He speaks a Latin-based language, so he knows there's not that much difference from if you know some of the romance languages that are based in Latin. If you speak Italian or you speak Spanish, you to segue from there to Latin is a lot easier than going from English. But so he would know that if you're looking at Latin texts, and even many times when I'm talking to Christopher Yetzer, he'll say, well, Beza in his Latin is saying this, and he does translation work from the Latin. And obviously he's speaking Italian, which is not that far detached from the Latin. Yes, it's a different language, but it's the Italian roots into Latin and the Spanish roots into Latin are way closer than the English one. So yeah, there's a world of difference between this and the very real departures from the TR that exists in the 1960 revised version, or Reino Valera, I should say. According to Yetz's research, the 60 Latin Vulgate readings in the King James Version are not in any real conflict with the Greek Textus Receptus. In other words, these are not places in the King James Version where the reading contradicts the Textus Receptus. The Latin Vulgate was simply consulted to consider other options for word choices. These are translational, linguistic matters, not matters of a critical text versus the Textus Receptus. So to put it in other words, the going to Latin is a natural process because so many words in English come from Latin. So sometimes there would be a word that people would use every day and they wouldn't even know it comes from Latin unless you learn Latin. And you're like, oh, that comes from a Latin word. Now, obviously the King James translators know that type of stuff, but they're not just going to depart from something because it's got a Latin etymology. Now, and that's got nothing to do with the words of the Textus Receptus. if you have a Greek word and it means something in English, just because, 300 years before, people in England started to use this word and it originated from a Latin source, it doesn't mean it's from the Vulgate. Perhaps it is from the Vulgate inadvertently, but it just entered into society, into the way that people speak. So Bible Highlighter says, I like the etymological apology there on Beelzebub. Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I've got a bit of information on my, if you type in 190 Beezer into Google, you get this page, variations on Scrivener. Now, I do have Beelzebub here, I think. Yeah. So I'll just make this bigger. Whoops. Okay. Made the other page bigger, but not this one. There we go. So yeah, Beelzebub. So 1598 Greek is Beelzebub. So the Scrivener changed it here. There was no reason to change it. It's not like they went, it says Beelzebub in the Greek because it says it in English. So this is the thing with Scrivener. Sometimes he's changing things and it's not necessary. The Complutense and Polyglot, they have Beelzebub, but the rest of these editions have Beelzebub. And so, yeah, anyway, I've got a lot said on that, so I might throw that into the chat. If anyone wants to study through that, I think they'll get the understanding. Okay, so there's 6 passages where Beelzebub is in the underlying Greek, where the article said there was 7. I'll have to double check that. So yeah, basically I'm pretty harsh on him. I say, yeah, it's quite interesting because he only changes Beelzebub, the Beelzebub thing, in one place. Where the rest, so he changes it to Beelzebub here, but then he has Beelzebub in the other places. So let's have a look at those. Maybe I'll just grab Beelzebub. No, they all appear around here, but I'm pretty sure there are other places where I've got Beelzebub. But anyway, I don't want to bore you guys, so I'll actually shut that down. But I'll go back up to Beelzebub. So yeah, here we see in Beezer's text, he just has Beelzebub here. Okay, so they put the wrong letter in there. It's a bit of a typo, but Beelzebub. Okay, so it's got the lambda at the end there. And if you translate that into English, it's Beelzebub. So, and they're like, that's the Latin. The King James is from the Vulgate. It's like, no, you just don't know what you're talking about. So let's continue on. Yeah, so Yetzer concludes his article with the following statement. A more thorough review of available sources suggests that the influence of the Vulgate has been overstated in this list, and that the translator's decisions were often more nuanced than Scrivener's list implies. So, and that's the conclusion I've come to with Scrivener. With my article, it's like Scrivener made lots of mistakes. He oftentimes says things that is just parroted by critical text people, to prove their point against the King James. But when you examine it, it's like, no, Scrivener was wrong. But then people go, you think you're better than Scrivener, or they falsely go, you follow the Textus Receptus of Scrivener, and now you're saying he's wrong. So you're sort of biting the hand that's fed you, sort of thing. It's like, no, I don't have to agree with him. So in other words, while it's true that the Latin Vulgate was consulted in the process of investigating word choices, the Latin Vulgate was simply one of many sources considered. Not to mention, it is possible that Latin influenced readings in the King James may have been influenced by the Latin text of Erasmus or Beza of Stephanus or Jerome, or another one, or a combination of them, or all of them. And I guess I would add to that, or just the English language was Latinized. I mean, the Romans were in England for what, like 400 years, I'm pretty sure it was, which would have a huge influence. There's a really good podcast on Spotify called The History of the English Language. I would encourage people to go through that. At the moment, or the last ones I listened to, he's going through Shakespeare. So he's gone right from day dot. I don't think the guy's a creationist, but he goes through from the Proto-Indo-European through to English, or through to early Germanic, French, Anglo-Saxon, and then through to the English, then going through Beowulf and going through, Wycliffe and a whole bunch of other influences. He talks about Erasmus. And so it's a very interesting and informative podcast. So I'd recommend that people go through that. I haven't listened to it for quite a while. I actually forgot about it. And just yesterday it came up on my Spotify and I was like, I've got to get into that guy again. I think I've gone through like 150 podcasts of his. History. History. Yeah, History of English podcast. So it's up to lesson number 175, which is Romeo and Juliet. So obviously there's going to be lots about Shakespeare, but it's very interesting because he'll talk about the first time a word appears in writing. And so it might be, he goes a lot through Bibles like Tyndale. And so it's just a very interesting journey to go through the English language. And I think anyone who has an appreciation for the King James, you eventually fall in love with etymology and understanding where words come from. So I think people of that type of interest would be very fascinated by that podcast. So translating is tricky. As a bilingual preacher and former missionary who has been involved in 2 Bible translation projects, who has translated books and tracts into Spanish and English, I understand how challenging translation can be. Calvin George, likewise, should know better, but he is too driven by an agenda to see clearly what ought to be plain and obvious to anyone that is bilingual. The majority of words and phrases in any language are translatable. Other words and phrases, however, don't always have a clear equivalent. A clear equivalent. Excuse my dyslexia there. That was a bit of a strange speako. They don't always have a clear equivalent available. If you've got a clear equivalent available, that might be something else. So translating from Greek to English could be challenging at times. Sometimes there may be a word choice in Latin that is better suited for the English Bible, which at the time does not conflict with substance with the underlying Greek. The King James Version translators, the KJV translators was the greatest collection of, I guess that probably should say the King James Version translation project was the greatest collection of linguists and scholars that ever assembled for the purpose of translating God's words. And I believe that too. I don't think there's been anything like this before or since. And that's one of the reasons why the King James is the standard. The fact isn't even arguable. And that's true. The KJV translators were skilled enough to know how to utilize the Latin without compromising the underlying Greek basis of the TR. Again, just because something was influenced by Latin does not automatically make it anti-TR. That is a shallow conclusion. Calvin George's association against the King James Version is shallow. These Latin influence renderings in the King James Version do not conflict nor contradict the collective consensus of the Textus Receptus. They agree in substance. They are in harmony. Dr. Jack Moorman said that the Latin and Greek word choices complemented one another. There is a difference between something that complements and something that contradicts. Calvin George should know better. The truth is too clear that he is trying to imply something different about the sprinkling of Latin in the King James, shows that he is being intellectually dishonest. He is blinded by an agenda. So the actual critical text corruption in the Reina Valera 1960. Meanwhile, the 1960 Reina Valera, which Calvin George defends, there are real actual departures from the Textus Receptus. I'm not talking about different ways to spell a word or differences in nuances of word choices. I'm talking about actual corruption that exists in the 1960 Reina Valera due to an intentional bias in the critical text. The man who changed the 1960 Reina Valera revision committee, or who managed the 1960 Reina Valera revision committee, Eugene Nida. So I didn't know Eugene Nida was behind that. I probably read it before, but it's like, man, he is so bad. He's the father of dynamic equivalency. He trained the Jesuits to do Bible translation. He's just like toxic when it comes to this field. So he admits it. So this is his quote. Nevertheless, in some instances, there were where a critical text is so much preferred over the traditional Textus Receptus, the committee did make some slight changes. The Bible Translator, Volume 12, Number 3, 1961, page 113. One of the 1960 revisers, Dr. Jose Flores, admitted departures from the TR here. One principle added to the first list of the Reina Valera 1960 revision committee was that wherever the Reina Valera 1909 version has departed from the Textus Receptus to follow a better text, we did not return to the Receptus. Point 12 of the working principles states, in cases where there is a doubt over the correct translation of the original, we consulted preferentially the English Revised Version of 1885, the American Standard Version of 1901, the Revised Standard Version of 1946, and the International Critical Commentary, so that's in the El Texto del Nuevo Testamento by Jose Flores, page 323. This is irrefutable evidence. It is so undeniable that at times even Calvin George is forced to admit it. A few departures come from a critical text, The Battle for the Spanish Bible by Calvin George. And he says, there were some departures from the Textus Receptus in the 1960, as Eugene Nida testifies, The History of the Reina Valera, 1960 Spanish Bible by Calvin George, page 120. Calvin George knows that his Spanish Bible is tainted with the critical text. He just wants us to accept that this is okay by trying to convince us that the King James Version is sprinkled with critical text variants as well. This is false, however. He has no real proof to back up his hypothesis. So that's pretty much a summary of everything that's been spoken of. And I think he's made a really good point of that. And so obviously, if you don't read the Spanish Bible, this mightn't be of that great interest to you, but I'm going to read this through all the way through to the end. Meanwhile, Dr. Flores made it very clear that they deliberately departed from the Textus Receptus to follow a better text, which for them is the critical text and the critical text-based Bibles. Why wouldn't they? They were of the critical text school of thought. Flores even listed the critical text-based Bibles that they followed to make the changes in the revised version of 1960. Sorry, the Reign of Valera. Every time I see RV, I'm thinking revised version. So the Reign of Valera of 1960. The revised version of 1885, which is the original English Bible based upon Westcott and Hort's text. So that's the first one mentioned. The American Standard Version of 1901. So that is based upon the same text, but the American edition. And then the Revised Standard Version, which is the one Bruce Metzger actually worked on that. And then they brought out the 1952 edition, which was so bad that I'm pretty sure even James White, in one of his earlier videos, he actually calls it a Bible perversion, which is pretty bad. I think he was talking to Gail Ripplinger or something, or doing a show on against her. And I listened through this because it's just like, oh, well, I'm going to be associated with all these people. Listen through it, and he said, yeah, I don't agree with Bible perversions when they were talking about this. So it's interesting. Anyway, Calvin George is trying too hard to manipulate the truth or ignore reality. The reality is that the 1960 revision of the Reign of Valera was a critical text effort, and the King James Version was a received text effort. The translation philosophies behind both groups were totally different. George's emotional attachment to the 1960 Reign of Valera causes him to live in denial of this reality. Therefore, his discernment is compromised, and he is trying to sell his audience an inconsistent, flawed, and muddied view of both Bibles. The disturbing thing is many Hispanics are falling for it. Due to the deliberate use of the critical text and corrupt critical text-based Bibles, there are real departures from the Textus Receptus in the Reign of Valera 1960. The omission of the words without a cause in Matthew 5:22 is a real departure from the Textus Receptus. The omission of the words by Jesus Christ in Ephesians 3:9 is the same type of departure from the Textus Receptus, which affects the doctrine of the deity of Christ that we complain about in corrupt English Bibles. The omission of the word Lord in Luke 23:42 is a real critical text influence omission. The change of the word her purification to their purification is a critical text influence change, which makes Jesus a sinner, since the word there makes the sin offering apply to him as well. The addition of the words unto salvation in 1 Peter 2:2 is a real critical text interpolation, which causes the 1960 to teach a works-based salvation. We could go on and on. Check out our many articles and charts all over our website. So this is the Reina Valera Gomez edition. To see tons of irrefutable evidence of Textus Receptus departures and real critical text influence in the Reina Valera 1960. So overall, Calvin George is arguing apples and oranges. There is no similarity between the real Textus Receptus departures that exist in the 1960 Reina Valera and the sprinkling of Latin readings in the King James Version. None whatsoever. The burden of proof. In the United States, we have a legal principle, innocent until proven guilty. The burden of proof is upon Calvin George to demonstrate that there are Latin influence readings in the King James which reflect Jerome's Vulgate in any way that contradicts the collective evidence of the Textus Receptus. I'm not talking about translational differences of word choices, synonyms, or different ways to spell word equivalents in different languages, but actual contradictions, especially those of doctrinal significance. He has not done this. He cannot do this because the truth is that there are no real departures from the Textus Receptus in the King James Version. A reading that reflects Latin wording more than the Greek equivalent does not constitute a departure from the Textus Receptus. I'll have a sip of my drink. I'm speaking quite a lot. As we have demonstrated, Calvin George George claims departures from the Textus Receptus by twisting the words of good men like Jack Mormon and ripping them out of context, while hoping that no one does the homework to discover his dishonesty and self-serving agenda. Calvin George is not counting on people to think things through and scrutinize his false claims. We at the Reina Valera Gomez Bible Society are not going to let him get away with it. And good on you guys for doing this. He has gotten away with this for far too long. We will continue to point out his misinformation because he is leading good Hispanic Christians astray. He is leading good American pastors astray also. He is causing discord and hindering good Christians from working with each other. We should all be unified and standing together for purity in not only the Bible in English, but in Spanish and every other language as well. Yes, and I would say that is my heart as well, to have the Bible, accurate Bible in every language. Yet Calvin George insists that we are the ones causing the division. We are not. We are standing for the purity of God's words. Falsely accusing the King James Version of containing the leaven of the critical text is divisive and deceptive. Justifying the critical text in the Reina Valera Bible instead of correcting it is what is dividing good Hispanic fundamentalists. American pastors who claim to stand for the King James Version and Textus Receptus need to stop letting him get away with this. They are sacrificing the integrity of foreign Bibles on the altar of, well, we just need to get along and win souls. Why can't we win souls with the Bible in Spanish that is 100% pure and totally based upon the received text like the King James Version? Meanwhile, Hispanic brethren are being told to get their perspective on Bible translations from a guy who undermines the King James Version when he's in front of a Spanish-speaking audience and justifies the corruption of the Reina Valera 1960. When he's in front of a King James Version church in the US that may financially support him, he acts like he's a true TR man or a King James Version man. He isn't. True proponents of the Textus Receptus and King James Version don't accuse the King James Version of departures from the TR. Pro-KJV pastors and churches in the US would never allow someone to undermine the King James Version like this in front of their congregations. But for some reason, they are okay with him undermining the King James Version to Hispanic audiences. What's worse is that if anyone, like those of us in the Reina Valera Gomez Bible Society, dare to ask for consistency, we are seen as troublemakers with a bad attitude. While it is unfortunate to see those who are being led astray by Calvin George's misinformation, we are grateful for those who understand this issue enough to see clearly what is going on. Many are getting their eyes opened to the corruption that has infiltrated Spanish Bibles like the 1960 edition of the Reina Valera. Many are seeing that the Reina Valera Gomez Bible is the purest and best option. Therefore, we will continue to produce material such as this article to keep those who have the backbone to stand for what is right. 2 Corinthians 8:21, proving for honest things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. And then it has an addendum with Chapter 5, support for minority passages in the Authorized Version, a manuscript digest. I'm not sure if I need to read all that, but it just has okay, so I'll just go to the bottom of this. So that's when the King James Version departs from the majority text by Jack Mormon. Okay, so that's his words that were taken out of context. Okay, so that's that. I've gone for about 3 hours. I think I might move away from this. Now I will show you. This is the Christopher Yetzer. I'll make this nice and big. So this is the article. I might go through this next time. Okay, it's part 1 of the article, so you can download the PDF there. So I'm just going to look at some of the examples. I know Beelzebub was the first big example. So examples 1 to 7. Okay. They seem so trivial. These tiny little things. It's like, oh, is that plural? Is that singular? And half the time you can have something that's singular, it's made plural by the context. You know, if I said I've got my phone, if I said turn off your phone, and I'm talking to 100 people, that could be 100 phones. You know, it becomes plural in the context. You know, and so when you've got people like Scrivener saying, you know, rabdon and rabdos, oh, you know, don't take a staff. Is he talking about one staff? Well, in the Greek, it's singular. But he's talking to all the disciples. You just got to read the Bible and read the context, because you have a lexical definition and then you have a contextual definition, and the contextual definition overrides, because he's obviously talking to a group of people. He's used a singular term like we do in English often, and it becomes plural in context. So it's not just like they've got one staff and they all hold it or something. It's a magic staff and they all hold it up. It's like, well, anyway. Yeah, there's lots of misinformation from Scrivener. And that's where I would just encourage people to, go through this article by Chris Vietza. I think we will go through this next time. So I might even do this tomorrow. It's a lot heavier than what I've just read through. And it might even take a couple of videos. It might even take 3. I mean, this is only part 1 when we go through that. And then there was, it said joins onto part 2 here. Yeah, so. Yeah. So anyway, I will shut this down. I will just remind you guys that we do have coming up a debate this weekend. Well, not this weekend, because you guys are a day behind me. So next weekend we have, and let me just grab my history here on my videos. Live. Let's check this out. I don't know why. I know YouTube go to this thing now instead of just going to a web page. It's got its own little page thing, which, I mean, they're owned by Google, and I run Chrome, and it's like, why do I want this whole extra page here? But anyway, so this is free will versus predestination. It's a discussion. So it's Matt Singleton and Will Kinney. So I'm going to be moderating this. So it is not a debate, but it is sort of a debate, but it's more of a discussion. So that's what Will Kinney wanted to do rather than have a debate. So that is going to happen on Saturday, the 23rd of August, 5 p.m. New York City time. So join us for that. And what else have we got to announce? I think that's about it. The following week, I will have a special guest on. We're going to start talking about the Old Testament and the Hebrew. And because oftentimes we're just dealing with the New Testament, but we want to talk about the Masoretic text. We want to talk about whether the vowel pointings were there. We want to talk about things like the Septuagint, the influence of the Hebrew. Was the King James translation based upon the Hebrew text, or does it have Septuagint readings? We want to go through all that sort of stuff, and we want to become familiar with that side of the argument. And so I think apart from that, I'm going to bail. And so as a summary, I would just say Emmanuel Rodriguez, it's a good article. Probably the only thing that I would critique is just the Benjamin Wilkinson quotes. I mean, sometimes we don't really need to quote stuff that's questionable, and it just sort of makes people because I'm always playing devil's advocate with myself, and and I would go, okay, I'm not going to quote even quoting J.J. Ray. It might be good, but my alarm just goes off because these are older books in a sense where I know, I could probably quote, Hills or D.A. Waite. I'm just not sure about Ray, and I might have even heard stuff about it. And I was sort of like, Ray having that sort of cringy thing, and then it went to sort of pretty much directly quoting Benjamin Wilkinson through Jack Mormon. And I'm like, I understand he might be right, but it's sometimes it's good just to move away from that and just get something else. But apart from that, as a critique, I'd say it's very good, very well written. And I think you get your point across. And yeah, it's accurate. So anyway, I will shut this down. Thanks for joining us, guys. God bless you, and we will see you again next time.